Chapter 157, Have you ever loved someone? You want to hunt me a broken bar? Do you think I'm as foolish as Hermes? Aphrodite was furious, but there was also a hint of amusement in her laughter. It's not hunting, Promise replied calmly. The reason why I hunted Hermes was because everything he did was for amusement, so I thought it fitting for him to be the one entertaining others. As for you, the young man gave her a serious answer. So naturally, I won't hunt you, Goddess Aphrodite. I simply want to ask you one question. A broken bar as the goddess of love, beauty and desire, one of the 12 gods of Olympus, have you ever cared about the lives of others? And a broken bar, have you ever truly loved anyone? As soon as Promise finished his question, Aphrodite hadn't fully processed his words when a goddess dressed in black, with black hair and red eyes, appeared in the temple, accompanied by a swarm of underworld butterflies. It was none other than Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and magic, and Medea's teacher. As she stepped into Gods of Beauty, Aphrodite's temple, flowers from the underworld bloomed beneath her feet, and the fluttering butterflies filled the air, darkening the space as she began casting the spell of fate that had been prepared for a long time. Helen's eyes widened as she recognized Hecate. She naturally knew the other party. After all, she had been saved by her once before. But before Aphrodite could fully react, Hecate had already completed her magic. The wings of the underworld butterflies fluttered down, landing on the goddess of beauty and shrouding the temple in darkness. Promise, do you believe me when I say that after this, I'll throw myself into the abyss of the underworld? After doing all this, Hecate said with a sigh of relief, glaring at Promise with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You've already tricked one god, and now you've become addicted to tricking a second one? And this time it is the main god of Olympus. I can't even imagine what you'll dare to do in the future. She continued, exasperated, and please, I'm begging you, please be a decent person. If you want to cause trouble, invite someone else. Can't you mess with someone else instead of dragging me into your schemes? No, Promise responded decisively. And I don't believe you would actually jump and hide in the abyss. At least not right now. After all, Medea hasn't returned home yet. He added with a sly grin, beautiful goddess Hecate, you wouldn't want your student to be left in tears, would you? Hearing this, Hecate's face twisted with fury, and she nearly lost control of her expression. But by then, Promise had already grasped the threads of fate. Seeing this, the goddess glanced at Helen and noticed Cupid's bow and arrows nearby. So, in an act of petty vengeance, she wrapped Helen in the same fate she had cast around Aphrodite. In fact, from the moment Helen had first met Promise at the temple built upon a pile of severed heads, she had known he was an extraordinary person. After her experience in the labyrinth when she was unable to get out of it and hearing more about Promise from her goddess Aphrodite when she returned, Helen became even more certain that she couldn't let Promise slip away, because this world would never see another like him. Even so, she still hadn't expected Promise to be capable of something so outrageous, something that completely shattered her understanding of the world. Goddess Aphrodite broken bar was crying. Helen watched in disbelief as the goddess of love and beauty, the same deity who had always taught her how to dominate men and trample everything in the world underfoot, the exalted goddess she had once revered, collapsed before her in a flood of tears. Promise had enacted his revenge on the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. It wasn't a hunt. It was a glimpse into fate. He made Aphrodite see, at that very moment, the birth of a crimson rose. A white rose stained by her own blood, forever turning red and symbolizing eternal love. Oh, great and lofty goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, if I may ask, have you ever truly given your love to anyone? On the island of Lemnos, inside Aphrodite's temple, when Hecate, the goddess of roads and opportunities, appeared, the dark sky descended like a morning moon. She performed what seemed like a magic from the age of gods. No, in the hands of this goddess the so-called magic seemed to be closer to a miraculous spell. That was the magic of fate. Even the great goddess Aphrodite, one of the Olympian 12, was enveloped by Hecate's power. This was the true might of Hecate, the ancient goddess of crossroads and magic in Greek mythology. Although she often appeared unreliable and laid back, especially with Promise and Medea, She was undeniably powerful. Even among the 12 Olympian gods, the only one who could firmly overshadow her, besides Zeus, was that one other deity. Let me think about it. If I were to give little promise a divine oracle during this trial of goddess of beauty, Aphrodite's, what would it be? A flawless face, with the corners of her lips gently curving into a smile. The goddess, clad in a pure white gown, lightly stepped onto the staircase leading to the divine realm. These were steps only gods could tread, and at the end of the staircase lay the Greek pantheon atop Mount Olympus. Beneath the radiant sunlight, the goddess's silver hair shimmered with a soft, glowing luster. Indeed, it must be about love, she mused. She is the goddess of love and beauty, the most beautiful of all the gods. Because of this, the gods love her, and mortal children adore her. She appears too perfect, but that perfection is like the surface of water, where even the smallest drop will ripple and shatter it. The goddess chuckled softly, her brilliant golden eyes glowing with absolute wisdom. Every veil of mystery in the world was laid bare before her gaze, hiding nothing. So, young promise, my divine oracle for you regarding Aphrodite is simple. That is, the goddess of love and beauty has never truly experienced, nor even understood, what love really is. With that, the goddess's words fell like a soft whisper as she stepped lightly back into the divine realm, leaving this long-delayed oracle for the young man she favored. Meanwhile, thunder rumbled in the heavens. In the heart of the divine realm, within the central temple, a towering male god sat upon the highest throne. Zeus, the king of the gods, had arrived. Comment 20 Comment Vote to Left Chapter 158. Why is it, she? Where broken bar is this place? When the darkness gave way to light once again, the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, opened her eyes, only to find herself standing in a beautiful ancient forest, with a confused look on her face. Instinctively, she tried to take a step, seeking answers, but quickly realized she couldn't move. As she struggled, someone suddenly appeared before her, and the face of that someone caused Aphrodite's eyes to widen in disbelief. Because she was looking at herself, Aphrodite saw a version of herself in front of her walking forward, her face showing clear impatience as she passed right through her own body. Before the stunned goddess could make sense of the situation, a voice called out, "Lady Goddess, wait for me." A joyful voice rang out. Aphrodite instinctively turned her head, and there, running after her shadow, was a delicate little girl. The girl had bright golden hair and a pair of green eyes that resembled promises. In her small hands, she held a vibrant red apple. "Adonis, stop following me," the goddess of beauty said with an impatient look on her face. "Go back to your mother." "I have no interest in babysitting." "But, Lady Goddess, look at this is an apple I just picked this morning. I wanted to offer it to you." "I don't need it." With a wave of her hand, the goddess of beauty, who was already a bit impatient, slapped the apple out of Adonis's hands. It fell to the ground, shattering, leaving the little girl standing there, bewildered and motionless. Aphrodite tilted her head, puzzled by the scene before her. Just as she began to question what kind of scene she was witnessing, another image flashed on front of her eyes. It was still early morning, not yet light. The same girl, Adonis, was struggling to climb an ancient tree, risking her safety just to pick the brightest, ripest fruit from the highest branch for her. "If I offer this to the goddess, she'll be so happy." Adonis said this while holding the apple with a very sincere and happy smile. Such a cheap offering. "How could I possibly be happy with that?" Seeing this, Aphrodite muttered quietly after a moment of silence, her tone indifferent. But for some reason, as she looked at the little girl in front of her, she immediately recalled the image of the apple smashing to pieces on the ground when her impatience stirred within her. She suddenly felt an odd sense of unease, though she wasn't sure why. However, while she stood there, momentarily lost in thought, the scene before her changed once more. It was as if she had traveled through the river of time or grasped one of the threads of fate, peering into the future. What unfolded next were a series of scenes, flashing before her like slides, each one featuring herself and the girl named Adonis. "Lady Goddess, Look at this. I made a flower crown. Isn't it beautiful? Can I offer it to you? Lady Goddess, are you thirsty? I'll fetch you some water right away. Lady Goddess, please slow down, wait for me. Like a shadow, Adonis constantly followed behind Aphrodite. But despite the girl's unwavering devotion, the goddess herself seemed to grow increasingly irritated with her. Any time that girl came up to her, she would either snap at the girl, ignore her entirely, or sometimes even send her on pointless errands, only to walk away the moment she left. The reason for this? This girl a broken bar. Why does she remind me of Hephaestus? And those green eyes a broken bar, they look just like his, Aphrodite thought, perplexed. But despite her confusion, she quickly dismissed the thought, deciding it wasn't important enough to dwell on. By now, she had mostly pieced together that everything she was seeing represented the future, and she suspected that this was part of Promise's revenge on her. Yet, she couldn't understand how any of this could be revenge. Was it somehow related to this little girl named Adonis? It seemed laughable to her. Aphrodite originally wanted to stop this ridiculous game, but for some reason, as she watched the little girl endlessly chase after her, she found herself thinking about Promise's final words. Goddess of love and beauty, have you ever truly given your love to anyone? Aphrodite wasn't sure what she felt in response to that question. She didn't stop the vision from continuing, and so, she bore witness to the unfolding of fate. Naturally, the masterminds of this whole event are Promise and Hecate stood watching from afar. Even Helen, who had been dragged into the scene thanks to Hecate's mischievous revenge, observed the scene. Although they were watching from a distance. Hey, Goddess Hecate, Promise asked, curiosity evident in his voice. This little girl named Adonis a broken bar, why does she seem so familiar to me? I feel like I've seen her somewhere before. Even Aphrodite had figured it out, so naturally, Promise couldn't miss it either. Tilting his head, he looked curiously at the beautiful goddess in the black dress standing beside him. HMPH. However, Hecate didn't answer. She crossed her arms, letting out a loud huff as she turned her head away, clearly sending the message, I'm really mad right now, so don't talk to me. This almost made Promise laugh out loud. Come on, you're Hecate, a revered and powerful goddess. Yeah, exactly. Especially those eyes a broken bar, they really look like. Helen chimed in, nodding as she glanced between the two, eventually concluding with certainty, they're exactly like yours, brother Promise. It's not just the eyes, Promise muttered, still puzzled. But why do I see traces of my goddess teacher in her as well? As he spoke, his gaze drifted toward Hecate again. Seeing that she was still maintaining her I'm mad, don't talk to me attitude, he couldn't help but tease. Ah, my beloved, most respected goddess. Don't be mad. How about I give you a shoulder massage or rub your back? Get away from me. Don't disgust me. Hecate let out a sharp cry and at the same time slapped the hand Promise had actually reached out with. I don't need your shoulder rubs or back massages. If you really want to please me, swear that you'll never bother me again. Before she could finish her sentence, Promise cut her off decisively. That's impossible. With a playful grin and a look that screamed I've got you, the young man flatly refused. Goddess Hecate, your words wound me. After all, I hold you in the highest regard. Damn it. Hecate clenched her fists tightly, her teeth practically grinding in frustration. For broken bar, oh, I'm sorry, esteemed goddess. Helen couldn't help but laugh out loud before quickly apologizing. I didn't mean to laugh, I am a little surprised. After all, I've never seen Brother Promise act like this before. After a brief pause, she also added thoughtfully, in fact, the way I see it, Brother Promise really does trust you. Goddess Hecate. Trust me? He's just out for revenge, that's all. Hecate felt that she was so angry that she didn't want to go out for hundreds of years. Her beautiful red eyes glared at the boy fiercely as she said, I've never met anyone as petty as you. Just because I gave you a disdainful look every time we crossed paths, you've dragged me into your mess again and again, using me as your backup muscle. Promise, still grinning mischievously, simply shrugged. Why don't you go to your goddess of fate, Clotho, for this whole fate-watching thing? Hecate grumbled. She's much more skilled in that area. Why are you bothering me? I'm worried about her, Promise replied without hesitation. What if Goddess Aphrodite causes trouble for her afterward? And you're not worried about me? Hecate's eyes widened in disbelief. Well, you're super powerful, Goddess Hecate, and besides, you could always just hide in the underworld. Promise's answer was so matter-of-fact that it nearly made the goddess' fists clench in frustration. Ugh, I really want to ignore all that and just pin him to the ground and beat him up. See? This is the true face of your dear Promise. Isn't it too infuriating? Doesn't he deserve a good beating? Hecate, still seething, turned toward Helen, pointing angrily at Promise. Not at all. The latter blinked her mesmerizing violet eyes and looked tenderly at the young man while replying with a soft smile. I actually think this rare side of Brother Promise Ice a broken bar rather adorable. Ah, Helen, you're such a good girl. I knew spoiling you all this time was worth it, Promise said, patting the girl on the head with a satisfied grin, then turning to give Hecate a smug look. The look in his eyes made the goddess roll her eyes in exasperation, her face wearing the expression of someone who had given up on life. Here, just let it all end, please, he broken bar. But wait, that's not right. As she glanced at the bow and arrow in Helen's hands and reconsidered her doting attitude toward Promise, a realization struck her. This is going to get interesting. Her previous weariness vanished, and Hecate suddenly lit up with newfound energy. After a quick glance at Promise, she smiled in a way that sent shivers down his spine. But before the boy could ask what she was thinking, Hecate diverted the conversation, turning her gaze back to the real focus of the moment, the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. And in response to Promise's earlier question, she finally answered, I don't know a broken bar. If you really want to find out what's going on, go ask Clotho yourself. After all, it's Clotho, the goddess of fate, the one who truly controls and glimpses the future. She knows all that's to come. As for me, my powers and this magic of fate merely show one possible outcome. Hecate, as the goddess of crossroads, dealt with a multitude of paths that could shape destiny. Her role was to add a little grease to the wheels of predestined events, allowing fate to take its course smoothly or go slightly astray. So, for this point, Hecate hadn't lied to Promise. She truly didn't know what this particular fate entailed, nor did she know how it would ultimately unfold. She had simply followed Promise's plan and found the person called Adonis within this thread of destiny. The question that loomed over all these, whether Aphrodite had ever truly loved Sumionia, was one Promise had known the answer to from the very beginning. Aphrodite had loved deeply, giving everything to that person. After all, in Greek mythology, this was well documented. Aphrodite did indeed have a lifelong love, and that love was none other than Adonis. It was because of this man that the white rose was stained with blood, becoming the symbol of enduring love. And at the same time, it was also because of Adonis that Aphrodite cursed all love in the world, casting a shadow of doubt, worry, pain, and sorrow over it. However, a broken bar. No, wait a second. Wasn't Adonis supposed to be a man? How did he become a she here, and why does she look like my goddess teacher? A broken bar. Chapter 159, It's over, she's really crying. Does this have something to do with me? Have I, without realizing it, rewritten fate again? Wait, that can't be right. If I had really rewritten fate, Goddess Clotho would have shown up by now, rubbing her crystal ball in my face. Promise was a bit confused. But no matter how much confusion swirled in his mind, the unfolding of fate before him continued uninterrupted. Meanwhile, Aphrodite indeed felt strange. Standing on the sidelines, she felt like a spectator alongside Promise and Hecate, yet because it was her own future being shown, it also felt like she was personally involved, living through it. Adonis was unusually persistent. Unexpectedly, no matter how much disdain or annoyance Aphrodite showed towards her, the girl never wavered. She continued to chase after the goddess, her clear green eyes always fixed on Aphrodite as though no one else in the world existed. Watching all this unfold in front of her eyes, even Helen couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. Ah, if only Brother Promise could look at me the way Adonis looks at Goddess Aphrodite. And then it was just like in the myths and legends. Well, not exactly like the myth. There was a subtle difference. In the original story, Aphrodite fell in love with Adonis at first sight. But at this moment, under the influence of Hecate's magic of fate, the future being shown now had Adonis tirelessly chasing after Aphrodite, rather than the other way around. The small figure of Adonis followed her day and night, never giving up. At first, Aphrodite's feelings were ones of disgust and irritation, but slowly, gradually, she began to give in, moving from resistance to reluctant acceptance. Through the small gestures and constant companionship, Adonis slowly carved out a place by the goddess' side. She continued to offer simple, humble gifts of fruits or flower crowns, nothing extravagant. Yet, these were the things that mattered most to her, and she gave them all to the goddess she adored. As time passed, Aphrodite found herself increasingly aware of Adonis. Though she never dropped her prideful demeanor, and still treated the girl with haughty indifference, she couldn't help but notice the girl more and more. Aphrodite knew herself too well. She realized that each time she cast her gaze toward Adonis, she was beginning to care for her. As time flowed on once again, a sudden, joyful cry broke the silence. Aphrodite watched as Adonis, calling her name, ran toward her with a beaming smile. Instinctively, the goddess reached out, wanting to pat the girl's head or pinch her cheek, but soon found out that her hand passed right through her, intangible. She could only watch as the girl reached another version of herself, the Aphrodite of that future, who haughtily accepted the affection as a matter of course, without acknowledging the girl's devotion. Seeing this, Aphrodite frowned and couldn't help but hum softly, and then she froze. "Am I angry?" she wondered, surprised by her own reaction. Because it wasn't as simple as just being angry. A strange, suffocating emotion churned in her chest, making her feel unsettled. Why is the goddess acting like that? Helen, standing nearby, puffed her cheeks in frustration and voiced her dissatisfaction towards her goddess aloud. "She doesn't know how to appreciate someone who cares for her. A broken bar brother Promise would never act like that, right?" Helen's eyes sparkled with hope as she looked at Promise, who couldn't help but tilt his head, confused. "Why am I being dragged into this?" Seeing Promise's baffled expression, the girl looked a little dejected but quickly pumped her fist in determination. "It's fine. If things continue this way, she'll figure it out eventually. After all, even the goddess has started to change a little, not to mention them." Even Hecate looked a bit surprised. Looking at the scene unfold in front of them, her gaze shifted between the flowing images of the future and the real Aphrodite, who stood there, staring blankly at Adonis. "Interesting. The goddess of love and beauty actually seems to have brought out her true love. Is this your revenge, Promise?" Promise didn't answer. He kept watching the scene in front of his eyes, then glanced at Aphrodite, who was gradually softening her gaze toward Adonis, only for her expression to turn sour with jealousy whenever she saw her future self. Thinking of where this might be headed. "Why do I feel like I've made a terrible mistake?" Promise couldn't help but mutter under his breath. The more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. Things were not going well. And it certainly wouldn't end well. He knew that Adonis was the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite's greatest love. It's just initially, he had assumed it was just another typical love story from Greek mythology, one of those impulsive attractions based on beauty alone. After all, that was how it was defined. Lust. Aphrodite being a female Zeus was the prime example. But now, my goodness, not only had Adonis become a woman, but more than that, she had successfully won Aphrodite over. Not just romantically, but emotionally. Aphrodite's gaze toward Adonis was filled with something far deeper, albeit love or maternal affection. It was clear that this bond had changed. And if this were to play out to its conclusion, a cold shiver ran down Promise's spine as he realized the implications. Goddess Hecate, maybe we should stop this," he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. But before Hecate could respond to his words, it was too late. The next scene came abruptly, as sudden and inevitable as fate itself. One moment, the young Adonis was happily running after Aphrodite, gathering offerings from the mortal world and presenting them to the goddess with her usual bright smile. In the very next moment, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, and rain began to pour, as if trying to wash away everything. On that day, the white roses were stained red. Just as in the ancient myths, the person named Adonis collapsed into the arms of Aphrodite, her body lifeless. No matter how loudly Aphrodite called out her name, she never opened her eyes again. The goddess of beauty stood frozen, her mind unable to process the scene before her. She was trapped in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Meanwhile, Promise slapped his forehead hard. Hecate, after a brief moment of shock, reacted instinctively as she flinched and immediately started to bolt. Say what you will about her, but the goddess certainly had fast reflexes. Goddess Hecate, where are you going? But how could Promise let her escape that easily? She was also the mastermind behind the scenes, so he grabbed her just as she was about to run. Let me go. Let me go. This has nothing to do with me. I know nothing. Hecate shouted, her frustration evident as she struggled, though not too forcefully. Despite being a powerful goddess, she couldn't bring herself to use her full strength, so she found herself helplessly restrained by a mortal. Promise, let go of me, she demanded, but he held on tightly. Brother Promise, what's happening? Helen was also at a loss as she looked at the scene, and said to the boy in a panic, this can't be real, right? Before Promise could answer, the scene shifted again as he found himself transported back to a familiar place near the bronze temple of Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship. Child, a goddess with long, golden hair that seemed to cascade to the floor, sat in a wheelchair, gently stroking the hair of the young girl named Adonis. Why do you care so much for Aphrodite? She obviously doesn't deserve it, because there's no love around her, Adonis replied, her voice soft and full of sincerity. I want to give her love. Then maybe she'll finally be happy. Her innocent and beautiful smile illuminated the room. Aphrodite stood in stunned silence, looking at the scene in front of her blankly. In that moment, she felt as if she had fallen into an endless abyss, overwhelmed by a suffocating sense of despair. She couldn't breathe. The magic of fate had completed its course. Suddenly, everyone was back on the island, in the temple of Aphrodite. This time, Promise didn't just grab Hecate, he outright clung to her, refusing to let go no matter what. Well, he still has some self-awareness. Though he wanted to take revenge on the goddess, he knew deep down that he might have gone too far this time, perhaps more than just a little. Hecate was livid. She could sense that Promise was trying to drag her down with him to avoid Aphrodite's wrath. But the problem is that she really doesn't want to get involved in this mess. Let go of me. I'm not getting involved in this. I don't want to die with you. Hecate snarled, trying to shake him off. Not so fast, Goddess Hecate, Promise shouted. He knew that, on her own, Hecate could easily slip away, leaving him to face the enraged goddess of love alone. Only you, Promise, Hecate thought bitterly. Only you could turn a simple revenge into a full-blown disaster. You've completely shattered Aphrodite's emotional state. Just as these thoughts crossed her mind, Aphrodite, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly spoke. No, a broken bar. Her voice trembled, haunted by the memory of blood staining her body and the girl's final words echoing in her mind. Aphrodite clutched herself, sinking weakly to the ground. No, please. He broken bar on to broken bar on to broken bar. Her body shook uncontrollably, her tears flowing freely as she muttered to herself, consumed by pain and sorrow. At this, both Promise and Hecate fell silent, while Helen stood completely frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, in the next instant, a Promise, you bastard, let me go. Goddess Hecate, this matter has something to do with you as well. Don't even think about getting out of this. You selfish. Let me go, please, I'm begging you. I'm sorry, Goddess Hecate. It really won't work this time. I'm really scared this time. You're scared? I'm scared too. Now let me go, you idiot. Chapter 160, When you return, that golden arrow of love will pierce your heart. Afternoon on the Argo. As the heroes aboard the ship heard Promise's lyre, signaling that it was time to depart, they all returned to the ship. But when they arrived, there was no sign of the young man, leaving them puzzled. Hercules, where's Promise? Jason, leading the group, asked the towering man in front of him, his expression filled with confusion. Wasn't he the one who called us back? Hercules didn't reply immediately. He raised his head and looked seriously in the direction of the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty on the island. As the hero closest to the gods in Greek mythology, Hercules had already sensed the shifts in the atmosphere of the island. He too was confused. After all, everything had long since settled, so by all logic, Promise should have returned by now. Then, a voice that sounded rather gloating was heard, breaking the silence. He won't be able to come back. Well, anytime soon. Serves him right for playing such a big game this time. Medea, who had been looking up in disbelief, saw the goddess Hecate appear before them, dressed in her black gown, with Helen in tow. Teacher? While everyone else was confused and shocked by Hecate's sudden arrival, Medea ran up to her, her emotions a mix of excitement and frustration. Teacher, why are you here? And how could you kick me out like that back then? You're too cruel. Upon hearing her words, the first to be surprised wasn't Jason or the other, so it was Helen. She, having seen Hecate in action twice before, was amazed to realize that Medea had such a close relationship with the powerful goddess. Cruel? You think I'm cruel? I think I'm the one who should be complaining. Hecate snapped, her frustration boiling over as she recalled how Promise had used her again and again, dragging her into his messes because of this very student. Hecate felt a brief urge to give another slap to her butt, but seeing the girl's confused, hurt, yet joyful and dependent expression on her appearance, she couldn't help but recall the scenes she had just witnessed with the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite and Adonis, and her heart softened once again. Sighing softly, Hecate bent down, ruffling Medea's hair and pinching her cheek lightly. She wanted to say something but held back, knowing it wasn't the right time. So, with a final glance, she dissolved into a swarm of underworld butterflies and disappeared. Even after Hecate's departure, the group remained in a daze. Fortunately, one person still knew something of the situation. Naturally, all eyes turned to Helen. Under the group's expectant gaze, the girl hesitated but knew she couldn't reveal everything that had happened. So she kept it simple. Brother Promise was taken by the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite. I don't know when he'll be back. As she spoke, her thoughts wandered back to the goddess' tear-streaked face as she left, trying to maintain her composure but clearly shaken. Brother Promise broken bar, he'll come back, right? Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, Atalanta murmured the name softly, her gaze sweeping across the gathered heroes. Set sail, she spoke in a calm, steady voice. We shouldn't wait for him. He won't be back anytime soon. What? Jason looked at her in disbelief. What are you saying? Atalanta, however, didn't feel the need to explain. She simply turned and walked away, her decision firm. Hercules furrowed his brow, glancing at Helen. Although he could see that she was a little absent-minded and obviously hiding something, after some hesitation, he did not choose to ask any further questions. Something about the situation reminded him too much of the time Promise had hunted Hermes, a matter best left buried, never to be spoken of. And this, too, was clearly another one of those things that should stay locked away, deep in their hearts. Wait till the morning. If Promise still hasn't returned by dusk, Jason will set sail. So in the end, Hercules came to the same conclusion as Atalanta. Wait, Hercules, what are you talking about? Are you planning to leave Promise here alone? Theseus came out at this moment and stood in front of Hercules excitedly, confronting him. Are you trying to abandon him? Don't forget why we all came together in the first place here. It wasn't for Jason, it was for Promise. Upon hearing this, Jason opened his mouth subconsciously, wanting to say something, but found that he could not refute. It's true, broken bar, but come on, I'm standing right here after all. At least give me some face here. It's not that we're abandoning him. I know he's off doing something more important. As he spoke, Hercules swept his gaze over the group, especially focusing on the likes of Meleager, the stag Actaeon, and Orpheus. You all should understand that, right? Meleager and Actaeon exchanged glances, recalling their past experiences with Promise, and then nodded in agreement. If I had to guess, the gods have turned their gaze toward him again, and now he's off on another distant journey, Orpheus said with a smile, strumming his lyre gently. I agree with Hercules. We should set sail. Otherwise, how can we ever hope to catch up to his footsteps? Let's face it, my friends, a Promise, the one we once sought to protect, is no longer weak. His name has spread throughout the world. He's become our pride, shining like a star in the night sky, a great hero." Hearing their words, Medea, who was watching Atalanta walk away, suddenly realized what was happening. The boy they had all wanted to shelter had once again gone off to paint the gods themselves. "There's no need to wait until dusk. Let's leave now." Melanie, now much more mature after all they had been through, said with a smile, "Orpheus is right. We're no longer the ones protecting him now, we're chasing after his brilliance. And there is no need to worry that he can't catch up with us," he added, his voice full of confidence, "because he's already caught hold of the falling star from the heavens. No matter how far we sail, that star will guide him back to us." The heroes, upon hearing these words, fell silent. With resolve in their hearts, they raised the sails and prepared to embark once more. Helen stood quietly, observing everything. She knew the hero's judgment was correct. It was undoubtedly the right decision, otherwise they'd only end up as a burden to Brother Promise. Still, she couldn't help feeling a pang of regret, wishing she could stay by his side for a little longer. As the Argo set off once again, Helen approached her twin sister, Pollux. "Sister Pollux, you told me that Brother Promise was so weak that he could be easily held onto." She came in front of Pollux and said with some dissatisfaction and complaints, "But now I see that he's so far away, no matter how much I try, I can never seem to reach him." Pollux blinked in surprise, looking at her younger sister with confusion and curiosity. Standing at the edge of the ship, facing the sea breeze as they sailed once more, Helen's expression darkened with sorrow. "What happened, Helen?" Pollux gently ruffled Helen's hair, her heart aching for her sister. Even if she didn't fully understand what had happened, no one could remain indifferent to the sadness in Helen's eyes. "In fact, I know that Brother Promise has always seen me as just a child," Helen said softly, her gaze wandering up to the sky as if searching for someone. "I tried to mask that, to do everything I could to draw his attention." She paused, her voice tinged with longing. "The goddess of beauty herself told me that one day I would become the most beautiful woman in the world, and no one would be able to resist me. So, I always thought I had time. I believed that I only needed some time, and once I grew up, Brother Promise would naturally fall in love with me. But recently, no, if I'm honest, I've known for a while now. I just didn't want to admit it." Helen's voice trembled slightly. "The truth is, I never had that chance, because his eyes have never truly seen me. In fact, it's not just me, they are the same." Thinking of this, Helen couldn't help but cast her gaze towards Atalanta in the distance. A person's eyes cannot be concealed. The moment Helen saw Atalanta, she knew. The way Atalanta's gaze constantly found its way to Promise told Helen all she needed to know. She was her rival. Over time, Helen had realized something else. Of all of them, this huntress was the closest to Promise. Yet she didn't understand why Atalanta never tried to reach out and take hold of him. The reason was simple, though. Atalanta had given up. To be precise, until the day Promise dies, Atalanta will never place that silver leaf at the finish line. Because she knew something that few others did, Promise's gaze had never truly rested on anyone. He has always been looking ahead, towards something greater, something far beyond the Malua grand finale that would be the greatest conclusion of the entire age of gods. So, when Promise rewrote Atalanta's fate and when Artemis entrusted her with the silver leaf, Atalanta made her decision. She would never be an obstacle in Promise's way. Instead, she would bear witness to the completion of his dream and, at that moment, offer him her final blessing. Since she couldn't get the love she wanted, she would give him the love he did. Helen didn't know any of this, nor would she have cared. She was Helen, a devoted follower of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. And Helen was faithful to her own desires. "I won't be foolish like the goddess Aphrodite," Helen said firmly. Pollux looked at her in confusion, watching as the girl extended her hand in the motion of drawing a bowstring. And with that motion, the golden bow, hidden within Helen by the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, materialized in her hand. Helen hesitated no longer. Her resolve was clear. "When you return, Brother Promise, I swear to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, that I will shoot this golden arrow, the symbol of love, straight into your heart." With her vow made, Helen's fate was sealed. 2 Left Chapter 161, The fates at that very moment, far above on the back of the white-winged Pegasus, a broken bar. Aphrodite glanced down toward the mortal realm, her eyes falling upon the distant figure of Helen. Is something wrong, Goddess Aphrodite? The boy in front of her asked, sensing her distraction. Aphrodite raised her eyes, her pale yellow gaze reflecting the boy sitting before her. It's nothing, she replied coldly. She had heard her devotees vow, but how could she possibly share that with the boy before her? After all, the anger and embarrassment this boy had ignited within the goddess of beauty had yet to be quenched. Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse, soared obediently through the blue sky, carrying its passengers Aphrodite and Promise toward a destination both familiar and yet unknown to Promise, the ancient Temple of the Fates. At this moment, Aphrodite had one goal in mind. She intended to visit the Fates and ask about her future, specifically about the young girl who had left such a deep imprint on her heart to Adonis. Where was that girl now? The goddess of wisdom, Athena, had already left her oracle. If Promise were to paint a true portrait of Aphrodite, the essence of it would lie in a single word: love. Athena, with her golden eyes of absolute wisdom, had already seen through everything about Aphrodite. Just as the goddess of marriage, Hera, couldn't control her own marriage, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, could never truly command her own love, nor would she ever experience true love that belonged solely to her. And this, in fact, was part of the reason Aphrodite had taken Promise. She wasn't that foolish yet. What's more, every god in Greece now knew one thing: that delicate, flower-like boy, though fragile, had hands capable of performing miracles. Even the gods couldn't, rewriting fate itself. Even the fates of the Olympian gods were not safe from his touch. The situation with Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, Hades, and Persephone had been proof enough of this. Goddess Aphrodite. Promise, feeling uneasy under the intense gaze of the goddess behind him, finally spoke up, his voice soft as he turned his head slightly. Actually, about what happened just now, a broken bar. I think I should apologize. However, before he could finish, Aphrodite interrupted. Just now? She shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes narrowing playfully, a beautiful smile gracing her lips as she spoke. Did something happen just now? Do you need me to help you forget? Oh, no, remember it? Her smile, although radiant, was anything but reassuring. No, no need. I think I've already forgotten everything. Promise quickly replied, turning his gaze firmly forward, his expression resolute. After all, he no longer had any intention of getting himself killed right now, especially when he was so close to fulfilling his destiny. There weren't many paintings left to complete, and the future he had sworn to Goddess Athena was within reach. It would be best to aim for a perfect ending, after all. Seeing his reaction, Aphrodite let out a soft, amused hum. But as Promise turned away, her face showed a complicated look. What Promise didn't know was that, in truth, Aphrodite could no longer bring herself to act against him. After all, those same clear and beautiful green eyes that she knew so well now stared back at her through this boy. That face slightly similar to Hephaestus, and those eyes exactly the same as his. Could it be? Could this girl, or this mysterious figure with Promise's eyes, be their daughter? Aphrodite's thoughts wandered toward the vision she had glimpsed through fate. The more she looked at Promise, the more her mind spiraled into these strange, absurd ideas, even though she also found that her thought was a bit ridiculous. However, an odd emotion stirred in her heart, one she couldn't quite put into words. After all, putting every incident aside, Hephaestus was still her husband. How could she describe this feeling? It was like Hera, after searching all over the mortal world, finally found her husband's use, only to discover that he had transformed into a beautiful woman and married Amana and was even living a happy, blissful life. It felt a bit strange. Well, anyway. Outside the Temple of Fate, when Pegasus landed gracefully, carrying both the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, and Promise, the three fates, dressed in their white robes, were already waiting at the temple entrance. It seemed they had been expecting them for quite some time. Noble Aphrodite, we are aware of why you've come. And Promise, broken bar, we've been waiting for you as well. The first to speak was Adripus, the eldest of the fates, who, bound by destiny, had long lost all emotions. She, who held dominion over death, was responsible for cutting the thread of life. Looking at Aphrodite, who was approaching with an anxious look, the eldest sister Atropos said to her slowly and without any emotion, "But the answer you are looking for is not here. Although I already know it, however, no matter what, I cannot tell you." Atropos, hearing her words, said. Aphrodite's face twisted in frustration and her voice turned sharp with anger. "What do you mean by that?" "Please, Goddess Aphrodite, calm yourself," came a frail but soothing voice, filled with a calming gentleness. Lachesis, the second sister who controlled the length of life's thread and was forever burdened by illness and suffering, softly spoke to the goddess. "It's not that we do not wish to tell you, but that we cannot. Because by bringing him here." Broken Bar. As she spoke, she coughed lightly and then gestured toward Promise, who was busy calming Pegasus. Even the smallest words could alter the course of fate. The goddess of beauty paused, taken aback by this response. However, just as she stood there, momentarily stunned, Clotho, the youngest of the three, the one who saw into the future, finally stepped forward. "Honorable goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, I can indeed reveal the answer you seek, as I am the one who sees what is to come. But the question is, are you prepared to face the consequences of the future? If you insist on knowing, you may never again see the person you so desire." When Clotho said these words, even Promise, who was watching her from the side, couldn't help but blink in surprise. After all, even though her voice was soft as always, yet, at this moment, it carried an unshakable authority. Though it still had its usual youthful tone, it was now very majestic, causing the goddess of beauty Aphrodite, who had moved her lips several times, to not dare to say a word. "Hey, is this still my goddess?" Clotho, with a soft voice, a flexible body, easy to push down? Promise thought in disbelief. Almost as if sensing his thoughts, Clotho, despite her eyes being milky white, glared pointedly at Promise. Come to think of it, the gods could actually see into his thoughts now. Well, it was no secret among the gods, that they could not read his thoughts, because the boy once had a silver strand of hair, left by Athena, the goddess of wisdom, that had shielded him from the gods' prying minds. However, that strand had been lost on his journey to reach Atalanta, and since then, his thoughts had been an open book to the divine. Later, Atalanta had tied his long hair with a simple cord, but that rope didn't have the same effect, so, the protection was gone. Buta Broken Bar, then seeing her stammer, biting her lip, unwilling to accept that this was the end of her search, Clotho, with a gentle yet resolute voice, spoke once more. "In truth, you need not search for anything. The answer has always been beside you. When the time comes, you will meet them again. And besides," she added, "you do not need to worry about the future you glimpsed through Goddess Hecate's magic. It will not come to pass." "Really?" Hearing this, Aphrodite's face lit up with hope as she looked at Clotho. Lachesis, offering a weak smile, replied, "Of course, noble Aphrodite. After all, it is my dear sister who truly governs the future. And since you've brought him here, what more do you have to fear?" she added softly. Aphrodite's tense posture finally relaxed, her expression softening at their words. As Lachesis finished speaking, she glanced once more at Promise, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "This young man has already sworn an oath to ensure that the future my dear sister, Clotho, watches over will always be the most beautiful." Chapter 162, When the Ocean Desires to Conquer the Sky. Hearing this, Aphrodite turned her gaze to Promise as well. Her eyes lingered on his clear green eyes, and for a moment, her expression flickered with an unreadable emotion before settling into calm acceptance. "So, that's how it is." "I understand now," she said softly. In that moment, it seemed as though something shifted within Aphrodite. Whatever complex feelings she had harbored, whether resentment, curiosity, or frustration, were momentarily put to rest. The words of the fates had offered her clarity, even if they hadn't given her the answers she originally sought. Aphrodite nodded gently and spoke to Promise, "Congratulations, you've passed my trial." Your music dispelled the desires of those heroes, and your vision of the future served as judgment for the women on the island. Originally, I intended to give you the painting here and now. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But, promise, you still need to return to Helen. Helen? The latter tilted his head slightly to express his confusion at the beautiful goddess in front of him. I told you I intended to destroy you. Did you think I was joking all along? Aphrodite's expression turned complicated as she continued. The desires of the heroes were meant to turn you all against each other. The women on the island were meant to stir up the desires in your heart, a broken bar, and to ignite Helen's jealousy and fury. In fact, the true trial I prepared for you has been Helen. From all along. Hearing this, Promise, who was still bewildered, couldn't understand the gravity of the situation. That's not a trial, Atropos, the eldest of the Fates, cut in, her voice emotionless. This goddess simply seeks to destroy you. Being the eldest and having no emotions, Atropos was the most rational of the three sisters, so except when it came to her younger sibling, Clotho. That girl named Helen has developed feelings for you, Atropos continued. And the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, who noticed this at the very first sight, manipulated her into falling into the depths of her own desire. Helen now carries Cupid's bow and arrow, the very one that represents love, and after all these events, she has already decided to shoot that magic arrow straight into your heart. When Atropos said these words without any emotion, Promise's expression changed from confusion at the beginning to enlightenment and finally horror. The girl named Helen is the most beloved believer of the noble goddess of beauty Aphrodite, so she is naturally loyal to her inner desires, Lachesis added with a smile, picking up where her sister left off. So, once she shoots the arrow of love at you and claims your heart, she will only do one thing. She will imprison you forever. She will keep you by her side, never letting you go. After she finished speaking, Lachesis coughed violently twice, but even so, it couldn't hide the upturned corners of her mouth and the gloating look in her eyes. Promise, promise. You make us work overtime every day, and now you will have a day like this too. Aye. Goddess Clotho, save me. Promise, finally realizing the seriousness of the situation, suddenly remembered all the times he had unknowingly danced on the edge of a cliff with Helen. His face paled as the implications sunk in. That arrow was no joke. It was Cupid's magical arrow. The very example of what would happen to someone who got hit by that thing was Daphne, who still stood as a laurel tree. So, the panicking young man lunged toward Clotho for help, only for the latter to push his face away with a look of disgust, preventing him from getting closer. What's wrong with that? My Helen truly regards you as an important treasure, Aphrodite said, crossing her arms over her chest and watching Promise's increasingly desperate reactions with a satisfied smirk. The thrill of vengeance danced in her eyes as she laughed. And she will be the most beautiful woman in the world in the future. So, what's there to complain about? No way. Even if I really want to get married, it should be with the goddess Clotho, who smells sweet when hugged and is soft to the touch. Shut up. Upon hearing his words, Clotho's face flushed bright red. She could no longer maintain her dignified goddess image as she furiously shoved her crystal orb into Promise's mouth to silence him. Stop spouting nonsense. Atropos and Lachesis remained expressionless, watching the chaotic scene unfold. They were used to this by now. Even Pegasus, grazing peacefully nearby, let out a yawn. As for Goddess of Beauty, Aphrodite, she was momentarily taken aback by Promise's audacity. She never thought that he would actually speak about marrying a goddess, but then she quickly remembered his achievements and found that it was not that surprising. After all, the young man in front of her had accomplished miracles no mortal should be capable of. Perhaps it wasn't so outrageous. In fact, regardless of other things, if we only count the matter of Hades, Demeter and Persephone, Promise was already qualified to enjoy a god status. Wait, a god? For a fleeting moment, Aphrodite felt as though she had grasped onto something important. She glanced at Promise with a thoughtful look, and subconsciously wanted to say something, but then she noticed the serious stares from Lachesis and Atropos. They were clearly warning her not to speak further. After a brief pause, Aphrodite finally spoke, her tone more contemplative. Actually, you might not need to worry too much. Now that I think about it carefully, that magical arrow may never even reach you. Promise blinked in confusion, his panic momentarily halting at her words as she continued. After all, Hephaestus has likely been aware of this situation for a while. Now I think, Athena sending me to her was probably her way of setting me up from the start. A broken bar, but promise, Aphrodite continued seriously, meeting his eyes. Regardless of what happens, you must face this love. This is not only because Helen is dear to me, but also because this is your true trial. Only by resolving this can I give you the painting. So, you have to complete it no matter what. Hearing her words, Promise felt silent for a while. He didn't say anything so capricious as to say that I could not give it up, because after a moment of silent contemplation, he realized there was no running from it. Thinking about that Lily Helen for a long time, he sighed silently, then looked up at Aphrodite, his gaze steady and resolute. I understand, Goddess Aphrodite. I will handle this, Promise said, his voice firm. I will properly face Helen's feelings and respond to her love. As soon as he finished speaking, Promise felt that his face was hit by the crystal ball. He tilted his head with an innocent look on his face, only to see that the goddess of fate had turned around and was walking away holding the crystal ball, with an expression that showed that he didn't want to pay any more attention to him. Ah, such a dear goddess. The second sister and the eldest sister looked at each other. The second sister, Lachesis, shook her head in amusement, then stepped forward once again, taking up the lines that should have been Clotto's. Promise, you cannot return to the Argo just yet. A broken bar. Have you forgotten? When you arrived, we told you we've been waiting for you for quite some time. Promise blinked, confused, as Lachesis's voice echoed. The ocean desires to conquer the sky, and thunder will be bound by love. When the supreme god himself is bound, who seeks to paint the gods, what choice will you make then? At this moment, Lachesis, with her light smile and air of wisdom, looked remarkably like Athena at that moment, recalling the series of events that had happened recently. Ah, my dearest goddess Athena, I'll remember this grudge, I swear it. Even with the golden apple tree incident, Promise had never really held a grudge against Athena. But this time, he really couldn't help it. Please go to the Mount Caucasus and the deepest parts of the sea, Lachesis continued. There, the foresighted god and the wise seer of the ocean will reveal all you seek. They will help you ascend to the highest place in the world, Mount Olympus. Chapter 163, Revenge on Athena. In Greek mythology, there was a god who regarded all humanity as his children. Even when faced with the torment of being chained and having his liver devoured daily, only for it to regenerate each night, he endured this suffering and humiliation for the sake of humanity, choosing to betray the gods for the sake of his children. This god Titan was called Prometheus, meaning forethought. In ancient Greek myth, this god of fire was the one who defied the Olympian gods by taking fire from them and giving it to humanity in the form of technology, knowledge and, more generally, civilization, only to get eternal torment for his transgression. After that, Prometheus was bound to a rock, and an eagle, the emblem of Zeus, was sent to eat his liver, which would then grow back overnight, only to be eaten again the next day in an ongoing cycle. And so, when Pegasus, with his sacred wings spread wide, carried the dark-haired, green-eyed boy away from the ancient temple of the Fates to the heights of Mount Caucasus, the boy found himself before this legendary god. Chained by unbreakable links forged by Hephaestus, the god of craft, Prometheus remained bound, yet even in his captivity, there was no surprise in his eyes as he gazed at the boy sitting atop Pegasus, with a weathered but warm smile. Prometheus spoke in a voice that was both ancient and raspy. "You've finally arrived, child." There was no trace of shock in his expression as he looked at the boy. He had known this moment would come, his foresight unwavering. And then, in his gravelly voice, Prometheus uttered words that stirred Promise deeply. "I have been watching you for a long time. Before you began to change fate, before the goddesses laid their eyes upon you, before you even became the student of Chiron, the wise centaur, and stepped into this world. Because, child, I have always been waiting for this meeting with you." Hearing Prometheus's words, Promise was taken aback, gazing at the frail, weathered god before him. his body worn by years of torment. He was about to speak when his eyes met Prometheus's eyes that remained brilliant and filled with a wisdom that shone through despite the suffering he endured. In that instant, all of Prometheus's doubts and confusion vanished, because he recognized those eyes, which have been too familiar to him. They were the same as Goddess of Wisdom, Athena's, a symbol of absolute wisdom. "I know why you've come to seek me," Prometheus said, his voice steady. "Go to the edge of the ocean. I've already told Pegasus where Thetis, the wise sea goddess, resides, so it will lead you to the gentle and wise sea goddess." Hearing this, Promise subconsciously glanced down at Pegasus, who nodded in confirmation. Everything Prometheus said was true. "And you don't need to worry, my child," Prometheus added with a strained smile. "I won't reveal your greatest secret to anyone." And then, without waiting for Promise to respond, the god forced a smile with difficulty and continued in a hoarse voice, "Because the gods who love you won't care about such things. The only one who might is the Goddess of Wisdom herself." Athena Broken Bar? Promise's confusion deepened. "Why would Athena care about that?" Seeing his puzzled expression, Prometheus chuckled softly. "That was the oath you made with her. Your very first oath. She's guiding you to become the greatest hero of this era, preparing for you the grandest finale." "But, child," Prometheus said, his eyes softening, "you must already know, deep in your heart, that this goddess, who is as dazzling as a pearl, loves you so much. So, while she will not break the oath between you, how could she ever bear to see you truly hurt?" With those words, Prometheus fell silent, refusing to answer further questions. No matter how much the latter prodded, he did not speak. "I find that I'm getting more and more disgusted with you riddlers lately," Promise muttered, in a complaining tone. Despite it being their first meeting, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closeness with this gentle god who cared so deeply for humanity, treating them as his children. "But, if you know so much," Promise said, looking at Prometheus in confusion, "after all, the other person was Athena. Does she really not know everything?" Prometheus gave a dry chuckle in response. "The crystal ball in the hand of the goddess of fate had broken bar since the moment she saw you. You've been held within it." Hearing this, Promise was stunned for a moment, then couldn't help laughing again as he said, "She's really quite the little tsundere goddess, isn't she?" Prometheus's smile deepened, but before Promise didn't drift too far into his thoughts, and asked the inevitable question. "So, noble Prometheus, how can I free you?" This was originally Hercules' task, but since he has already completed his journey and claimed the golden apple, that fate has fallen to me, hasn't it? Hearing his words, Prometheus did not show any signs of embarrassment, and nodded gently, saying, "Once this ordeal is over, I will be freed." "That is one of the reasons the fates sent you to me." "Then, how can I change the fate of my teacher Chiron?" "Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, can provide you with the sacred fire of the divine realm," Prometheus replied without hesitation. "It will prevent the regrowth of the Hydra's 9 heads." After he finished speaking, he looked at the boy, whose lips moved slightly, obviously wanting to continue asking, and cut him off with a weak smile, speaking in a hoarse voice. "That's enough, child. If I reveal any more, the goddess of wisdom might grow displeased with me. After all, she is the goddess who truly guides you. But she keeps playing these riddles with me." Promise curled his lips in dissatisfaction, looking at the god in front of him who, like Athena, had eyes that represented absolute wisdom. After a moment of thought, his face lit up with an idea, and he smiled mischievously. "One last question, truly the last. Noble Prometheus, how do you think I should seek my revenge on the goddess of wisdom?" At the mention of the word revenge, Prometheus paused. He looked at the boy standing before him, whose eyes gleamed with excitement and eagerness to try. "Child, it would be best if you spent less time with Hermes," Prometheus said with a chuckle, unable to resist. If Hermes were here, he would probably be bewildered and maybe even feel a little wronged. As for revenge, broken bar, Prometheus trailed off, considering the boy's expectant face. As for revenge. While speaking, Prometheus paused, looking at the boy in front him, whose face was filled with eager anticipation and couldn't help but recall the beginnings of this young mortal. Prometheus had said it before, and it wasn't a lie. He had always been watching Promise. From the very moment the boy had stepped into the world, he had observed his journey, his struggles, and his growth. As Promise made his way down the mountain, Prometheus, just like Chiron and the other heroes before him, had always been watching over the boy, unable to shake the worry he felt for him. Now, at this moment, seeing the boy before him, sitting atop the pure and majestic Pegasus, having undergone so many transformations and trials, Prometheus couldn't help but feel a bit dazed. "Yeah, Broken Bar don't know either." Snapping back to reality, he told his first ever lie to a human. Then, with a soft smile, Prometheus watched as Pegasus spread its silver wings, carrying the delicate boy once more into the sky, with the words of the gods in his heart. "Revenge, huh?" Prometheus chuckled faintly. "My child, do you realize, from the moment you met her, when your presence appeared in front of her golden eyes, and you offered her your very first painting, the one sealed by the vow, at that very moment, you have already exacted your revenge on the flawless goddess. For when you reach the end, when the final painting is completed, and the vow is fulfilled, that moment will be her ultimate defeat of the revenge she least wanted to see." Chapter 164, Her Vow to the Boy. "Wait, am I misunderstanding something here?" Promise stood there, completely dumbfounded, staring at the goddess, who had just calmly explained everything to him. "So, you're telling me that Goddess Athena, along with Queen Hera and Poseidon, have rebelled against the God King Zeus, and the task that she gave me is to go rescue God King from his imprisonment? Is it me, or is there something seriously wrong with this plan?" "Seriously, what's wrong with that goddess?" Even Promise felt very confused about this matter at the moment. Even though the idea of Zeus, the most powerful god in Olympus, being imprisoned was mind-blowing, Promise didn't react too strongly to that part. After all, he knew about this story as it was already part of the myths of ancient Greece. Poseidon had grown dissatisfied with the power he wielded and desired to control the skies as well. So, he teamed up with Goddess Hera, Athena, and Apollo, to imprison the god I circumflex superscriptoing Zeus in the temple of Queen Hera. What's more, the prophecy Promise had received from the Temple of Destiny made sense now. It seemed it was referring to this situation. As for how Zeus, the mighty ruler of the gods, had been captured, just as the prophecy suggested, Zeus had been blinded by love. To put it plainly, he had fallen into one of Hera's traps. And the chains that bound him? They were the unbreakable chains forged by Hephaestus. After all, only chains crafted by her could temporarily restrain the king of the gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, desires greater power, wanting to rule over more than just the seas. Hera, the queen of heaven, seeks revenge for Zeus's betrayal. But Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Thetis paused slightly, then looking at the black-haired, green-eyed young man in front of her, she said slowly, "I believe the reason behind Athena's actions of Broken Bar is you." "Me?" Promise was taken aback. Thetis nodded and said, "It's the only explanation for why such a flawless goddess would make such a reckless decision, and a Broken Bar why she would entrust you to me." In fact, Athena's choice to hand this critical task to Thetis, the kind and wise sea goddess, made perfect sense. After all, in the original myth, it was Thetis who played a key role in freeing Zeus. No, not the key role. It was none other than her, the sage of the sea, who helped the God King escape his bonds. What followed in that myth was God King Zeus's passionate love for Thetis. Yet, due to a prophecy revealed by Prometheus, that Thetis's child was destined to surpass its father, Zeus, filled with both anger and regret, decreed that no god could wed Thetis, forcing her to marry a mortal. This decision weighed heavily on Zeus's conscience, and to atone, he arranged for the most lavish wedding among the gods when Thetis married the mortal Peleus. It was at this wedding, notably, that Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited, leading to the infamous incident of the golden apple marked for the fairest, which eventually sparked the Trojan War. Things got worse and worse. But oh well, let's not talk too far. So, if one were to talk about the person who made the most regretful memories in the life of the god King Zeus, it would undoubtedly be the gentle goddess standing in front of Promise. Thetis. "Built a Broken Bar for my sake?" Promise frowned, still trying to grasp the full meaning behind Thetis's words. "Goddess Thetis, can you explain what this is all about?" Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, in the grand and magnificent temple of Hera, queen of the gods, the goddess Athena stood calmly in front of the daughter Hera's chambers. She was clad in her usual white gown, flawless and serene, but in her hands she held the Aegis, the invincible shield said to be capable of withstanding even Zeus's thunderbolts, and her golden spear. It was this shield, along with her formidable wit, that had enabled Athena, Hera, and their allies to successfully imprison Zeus in Hera's temple. Now, Athena stood as a guardian with her usual calm expression, even though the king of the gods Zeus himself was trapped just behind the door. "I never thought you would get involved in something like this." Apollo, the radiant god of the light, stepped out from the sunlight, his golden hair glinting as he approached Athena and said, "Because, to be honest, this is an incredibly foolish thing to do." While Apollo was technically part of the conspiracy, he had been less involved and had mostly been caught up in the momentum. Gods like Hermes had wisely fled the moment they sensed what was going to happen, avoiding the fallout entirely. "You must realize," Apollo continued, "that it's impossible to keep him imprisoned for long. Hera is merely acting out of anger, and the only one foolish enough to think this could work is Poseidon. So tell me, Athena, what were you really thinking?" Athena turned to face Apollo, smiling slightly and made no attempt to hide her reasoning. "Honestly, it's not as complicated as you think. I simply believe this is the best course of action." "The best course of action? A broken bar. You do realize, don't you, that the moment he breaks free, you'll be the first one he comes after?" Among the conspirators, the presence of Athena was essential. After all, even without Queen Hera, Poseidon, or Apollo, the rebellion could still function, but it would crumble without Athena. Only she had the strength and cunning to stand before Zeus in his wrath. Thus, when Zeus eventually freed himself from the restraint, the one he would care most about confronting would undoubtedly be her. "I'm aware of that," the latter replied, unfazed. "After all, I did take Hera's golden apple, and I've had my eye on her followers for quite some time. It's only natural that I'll need to pay a price." As she spoke, a small, self-assured smile crossed her lips. "After all this, everything that had happened in the past will be written off, and she'll never be able to hinder me again. And as for father, I know what he desires. When the time comes, and he is freed from his restraints, I'll swear an oath to Hema to serve him loyally forever." Apollo was silent for a moment, processing her words, before he too broke into a smile. "As I suspected," he said. "The real reason you've done such a stupid and reckless thing, a broken bar, is that boy, isn't it?" "Eh?" Athena blinked, feigning innocence. "Was it that obvious?" Apollo looked at Athena with a knowing smile. "You have no personal stake in this matter. Whether it succeeds or fails, you gain nothing from it. The only possible reason you'd get involved is a broken bar him." He paused briefly before continuing, "That makes the entire situation quite simple, really. After all, right now, he is likely the only one who can easily free father, especially since, aside from Poseidon, the god standing in his way are the ones who dotes on him the most." Apollo chuckled. "In fact, or rather, we," and emphasized, "Hermes, Hestia, and the others, have suspected this a long time ago. After all, up to now, the only time you, the goddess of wisdom, have ever made a mistake was over that boy when you stole Hera's golden apple." His eyes gleamed with curiosity. "So I came here just to confirm what we've all been wondering. Athena broken bar, do you like him that much? Was she truly willing to risk the wrath of Zeus, the king of gods, all for the sake of this boy?" Athena, however, remained calm, her face serene as she played with a strand of her silver hair. "I can't help it," she replied in a light-hearted tone. "I promised him, after all, that I would make him the most dazzling of all heroes." After all, to Athena, this was more than just a fondness for promise, it was a vow, one she was willing to stake everything on, even if it meant facing the wrath of Zeus himself. Chapter 165, Slap Her Hard. "I think it's because of the oath between you." In response to his question, the ocean sage Thetis, who did not like to speak in riddles, directly stated her guess and said, "That goddess of wisdom loves heroes and promise. You have to understand something, that is, you are truly special. You are smart, kind, and just. And your fate is intertwined with that of 4 goddesses. Although you may seem delicate, but you've repeatedly performed miracles that even impressed the goddess of wisdom, and even changed the fate of the gods. Not to mention, your greatest desire is to become a hero, and your ultimate dream is to end as a hero. As Thetis sorted through her thoughts, she suddenly stopped speaking. Her beautiful blue eyes. The boy looked up and down for a long time, making him feel a little uncomfortable. Then, with a sigh, she finally spoke again. Now that I think about it, I can suddenly understand why that goddess would do foolish things again and again because of you. Promise, I think you might just be Athena's treasure. To Athena, you must seem almost perfect. No wonder she has done more than one foolish thing for your sake. Thetis finished speaking, but before Promise could respond, Pegasus next to him nodded in agreement. Promise, however, coughed awkwardly, and said, "It's not that exaggerated." "It's not exaggerated at all," Thetis said with a soft smile. "After all, this matter really brings no benefit to Athena. The only thing she stands to gain is the ability to more openly and recklessly take you from here once this is all over." "Wait, is there really such a good thing?" Pegasus suddenly raised his head, eyes shining. Could it be that the drama of the 2 goddesses compete for a man is going to be staged again? "But if you do manage to save God King Zeus, doesn't that mean you'll have the last few paintings you need?" Thetis added. When Thetis said that, Promise finally understood. Out of the 12 gods in Olympus, after excluding the god of beauty, Aphrodite, he only had 4 gods left to paint: Zeus, the god of sea; Poseidon, Hestia, and the god of war, Ares. Among them, the paintings of Zeus, the king of gods, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, were undoubtedly the hardest. But if things went well this time, it would be as if he had secured Zeus's painting, and he might even be able to get Poseidon's painting in the process. So, in this way, Promise would have acquired the 2 most difficult paintings in one fell swoop. After his thoughts became clear, the boy subconsciously opened his mouth, wanted to say something but found himself speechless, his feelings becoming complicated. Before knowing all this, Promise had actually accumulated a certain amount of resentment towards the goddess of wisdom. He didn't necessarily mind her guiding his life. After all, this was part of their agreement to helping him become a hero and have a grand ending. But Promise felt she shouldn't drag everyone else into it, while sitting high above like an audience member, treating everyone as pawns in her amusement. Even though, he had to admit, that was very much like a Greek god. "How can she be so sure that I can save Zeus?" After a moment of silence, Promise couldn't help but finally speak. "That makes it even simpler," Thetis, however, said with a laugh. "Because if you really want to, aside from Poseidon, who else would really stand in your way? What's more, I believe the only chains in this world capable of binding even the god King Zeus are the ones crafted by your goddess teacher, right? And most importantly, Promisey Broken Bar, don't you still have that divine artifact with you?" "The god of the underworld, Hades' Helm of Invisibility." Thetis reminded Promise of the powerful artifact he had nearly forgotten, the very one that Hades had lent him, when dealing with the matter of Persephone. Promise had meant to return it, but up until now, it remained in his possession. With that realization, everything became crystal clear. It really has the style of the goddess Athena. At this point, Promise suddenly realized what was going on and nodded in understanding, muttering, "She really thought of everything and set it all up perfectly, huh? It's just that this is really starting to annoy me." As he said this, before Thetis felt anything, the Pegasus next to him had already raised his head and cast an extremely strange look at Promise. "Wait a second, my little master, what are you planning now?" When it comes to who knows Promise best, even Athena may not be able to compare to Pegasus, who has always been by the boy's side. So, it could sense when Promise was about to stir up trouble. And it was right. Promise felt very unhappy, not from being dragged into this convoluted scheme, but from the sheer intensity of Athena's protective and orchestrating nature. He now deeply understood how much the goddess of wisdom loved him. She had personally intervened, clearing the way for his victory, even going as far as making several foolish decisions, all for the sake of the oath they had made, putting that vow above all else. Goddess Thetis, don't you think Goddess Athena is being a little too overbearing? Promise asked, and hearing his words, Thetis nodded in agreement. Yes, she certainly is. Even though it seems like you could easily save the God King Zeus, this is a serious matter. After all, you're still just a child and shouldn't be dragged into something so dangerous. Thetis had been clear from the beginning she wasn't here to help Athena with her plan but to dissuade Promise from getting involved. In fact, she had already thought about how she could rescue the King of Gods, Zeus herself, without putting Promise in harm's way. After all, even Hermes and Hestia had distanced themselves from this mess, and yet Athena was pushing a mere child to take on such a massive responsibility. How was that even reasonable? Thetis was genuinely angry about this matter, especially considering that Promise had once saved her friend. She had a very favorable impression of the boy, so much that she had even blessed the Argo as it set sail. However, a broken bar. Wait a minute, I understand the truth, but Goddess Thetis, I don't think your anger and my little master's anger are the same thing. The Pegasus standing by saw the situation and wanted to say something but stopped. It was even glad that it couldn't speak. As it turned out, Pegasus was right. It was just as he thought. Promise wasn't upset about being involved in such a difficult situation. His frustration was more straightforward. It stemmed from Athena's overbearing affection for him. And so, the next words that came from Promise's mouth were something that, in this era, could easily be considered blasphemous. Even so, Goddess Thetis, let's go together. Let's go to the god's domain, and give that proud and arrogant goddess a good slap in the face. All right, you just wait quietly, and this matter to wait. What? Thetis suddenly froze, her eyes widening in shock. Processing the words and still feeling she heard them wrong, she looked at Promise with an expression that clearly said, did I just hear that right? Hold on, Promise, what did you just say? Chapter 166, Tie Her Up. I said, let's go give that arrogant and self-righteous goddess a good slap in the face. Promise repeated these words so calmly that even Thetis, the wise sea goddess, couldn't help but glance up at the sky, as if expecting a golden spear to come hurtling down. It's probably only because it's you, she thought, looking at Promise with a somewhat perplexed expression. If anyone else said that, they'd already be facing Hades in the underworld. Coming back to her senses, she looked at the boy in front of her with a strange expression. After all, don't you think it's so infuriating? Promise asked earnestly, his gaze fixed on the blue-haired, blue-eyed goddess in front of him. Everything is just as Athena thought. We are like puppets being led by the strings, always being led by her by the nose. She's manipulated so many things, causing so much mess, like the time she dragged Heracles into the mess just to steal the golden apple, and later had me save him. Then there's the issue with Aphrodite. She knew everything, but still let me and Helen get involved. That little girl didn't need to be on the Argo, facing all these risks. And now, she's gone so far as to imprison the king of the gods, Zeus, teaming up with Queen Hera, and forcing me to go rescue him, regardless of the consequences. Thetis blinked, listening as the boy's voice grew more heated with each passing word. Yes, that's it. She's made all the right moves. Every step she's taken was right. I have benefited from everything she did. I gained fame, paintings, and now I'm getting closer and closer to my dream. Well, listening to Promise words, Thetis thought to herself, I think she's simply placed too much faith in you. If it had been anyone else, Athena wouldn't have acted so recklessly. Though she thought so in her heart, she kept this thought to herself. After all, she could clearly sense the shimmering anger in the eyes of the young man before her, slowly building toward an outburst. I had no complaints at first. After all, when I made a vow with her, I had already entrusted my life to her. But, Goddess Thetis, a broken bard, you know what really makes me furious? What really drives me mad, Promise continued, his frustration boiling over as he said, is when, after dealing with all the chaos she caused, once you are exhausted from fixing every mess she created, that goddess just shows up out of nowhere, like nothing happened. And then she claps beside you, looking all proud of herself, as if saying everything went exactly as I planned. Come and praise me. Looking at the boy's anger rising little by little, Thetis tilted her head and imagined the scenario he was describing. Suppose everything unfolded according to Athena's plan, with her aid and the helm of Hades, along with Hephaestus's chains etc. Promise would go to Olympus, struggle through countless hardships to free the god King Zeus from the Olympian realm. Afterward, he would plead for forgiveness on Athena's behalf, gaining forgiveness for her, Hera, and the others. Finally, after everything was done and the helpers were completely drained, Athena would over with an expression that said everything was as expected, or maybe even complain about taking so long a broken bar. As she thought about it, Thetis found out that she could clearly envision the look on Athena's face at that moment. After all, the other party was Athena, so it was such a typical scenario. In that moment, the goddess of wisdom would certainly hold her head high, with the corners of her mouth slightly raised, her silver waist-length hair swaying slightly, stunning and absolutely beautiful, and actually a broken bar that really would make someone mad, wouldn't it? Thetis puffed up her cheeks as she clenched her fists and said softly, "Wait, seriously?" Looking at the goddess, Pegasus blinked in surprise. Is this another one that has been assimilated? Exactly. Seeing that goddess Thetis actually agreed with his words, Promise' eyes lit up as his excited voice grew even louder. So, thinking about all these plans, thinking about the look on her face when everything went according to her plan, doesn't it just make you want to mess up all her plans? Doesn't it make you want to land a good hit on that proud face of hers to see if the corners of her mouth can still be crooked? To broken bar. Thetis tried to stifle a laugh. Seeing the excited Promise in front of her, she paused for a moment before finally breaking into laughter. Covering her mouth, she elegantly said, "Promise, you don't know. Just hearing you speak like that a broken bar, one would think you truly despise that goddess of wisdom so much." "How could that be?" "I like the goddess of wisdom the most," Promise replied with a grin, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I like her so much that I want to use my paintbrush to leave a permanent stain on her pristine white canvas." "What a weighty kind of love that," I said. "Broken bar." "A broken bar? I never imagined you'd be this kind of Promise." Thetis covered her mouth and teased gently. "I always thought you were a well-behaved and sensible child." "Well-behaved? Sensible?" Hearing these unfamiliar words, Pegasus, who stood nearby, listening to their conversation, looked puzzled, with a huge question mark practically hovering over its head. Ever since it had been caught by Promise, it had known that this was a lawless boy who feared nothing. What kind of well-behaved and sensible person would try to catch a falling star? Pegasus thought. "Not to mention, you're as delicate as a flower." "No, to be honest, even flowers can live longer than you." Moreover, in almost 2 years of knowing Promise, Pegasus realized that there was only one time this boy had ever shown genuine fear, when facing the moon goddess Artemis, for some unknown reason. Oh, and there's also Apollo. Though, ever since Apollo met the laurel tree nymph Daphne, he seemed to have become less secretive about his worries. "But Promise, this is a serious matter after all," Thetis said, and as she did, her tone turned solemn once more. "This is a major event that even my father and other ancient gods are unwilling to participate in. So, I'm sorry, I can't let you do whatever you want. Although, I may not agree with Athena's actions, but the real reason I sought you out is not just because I did not want to keep you in the dark. It's also because my judgment tells me that you are indeed a more suitable option than me, and this will be of great benefit to you." "So?" Promise looked at the wise sea goddess in front of him and asked. "So although I agree with your idea, and even I would love to slap that flawless goddess." Having said this, Thetis couldn't help laughing again. "I can't act on impulse. Therefore, I can only give you 2 choices, child. The first option, leave everything to me, and I will end this conflict. The second, follow Athena's plan and do everything according to her steps. I promise that I will assist you in rescuing Zeus, the king of gods, and once again, the gods will be in awe of your achievements." Promise fell silent for a while, pondering her words before and said, "So, there's no room for negotiation then?" "Sorry, Promise," Thetis replied, her tone sincere. "I'm doing this for your own good." Promise looked quietly at Thetis, his green eyes locking with hers so intensely that the goddess began to feel oddly flustered under his gaze, though she didn't know why. Just as her heart quickened, a sudden, sharp painful sound broke through the tension. Turning her head quickly, the goddess saw Pegasus lying on the ground with an expression of agony on his face. "Pegasus, what's wrong?" Seeing this, she was suddenly startled and rushed to his side, kneeling down beside him, while Pegasus, in the midst of his dramatic cries, subtly glanced at Promise with a conspiratorial look. It was at that very moment that Promise quietly retrieved a painting from the sky. "And then a broken bar, it's decided." "My go-to goddess for any messer Hecate," Promise announced, and the very next moment, a shadowy butterfly familiar flew out from the painting, expertly dragging its lazy mistress from the depths of the underworld. During this period of time, Hecate seemed to be studying some magic potion, so as she appeared, the goddess was holding various bottles and ingredients in her hands, looking utterly confused by the sudden change of scenery. "Goddess Hecate, hurry up and use the restraints on Goddess Thetis and tie her up for me." Chapter 167, Why don't you ask Hera? Promise ordered, and the next moment, Hecate, who was still processing the situation, reflexively threw one of the potions in her hand toward Thetis. As the latter, wide-eyed and confused, watched the potion fly toward her. Meanwhile, Pegasus, who had just been groaning in supposed agony, had already leapt to his feet and bolted to a safer spot. "Well, this guy is clearly well practiced in dodging danger." The potion smashed against Thetis's arm, and its liquid splashed all over her. Everything happened so quickly that when the potion flew in front of her, all Thetis could do was subconsciously stretch out her hand to block it as the broken potion spilt onto her. However, given that this was one of the magic potions/concoctions prepared by Goddess Hecate, it wasted no time taking effect. Soon, Goddess Thetis felt her body grow weak, and she slumped helplessly to the ground. "Oh no, what am I doing? What is this place? Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing?" As Hecate stood, tilting her head in deep thought about the philosophy of life, she suddenly heard Promise's enthusiastic voice. "Nicely done, Goddess Hecate. Now, quickly, tie Goddess Thetis up before she causes any trouble." "Oh, right, a broken bar. Wait a minute." Hecate subconsciously took 2 steps further before her body froze mid-step and her face turned red with fury. "Not right. What are you even talking about?" Unable to bear the ridiculousness any longer, Hecate's temper flared so much that even though she knew her next move was going to lead to even bigger trouble, and get her chased by Hera, Athena, Hades, the god of the underworld and many more, but she didn't care. In a flash, she appeared beside Promise, who hadn't anticipated her sudden approach, then jumped up and delivered a magically enhanced punch to his head, sending him to the ground, cradling his head in pain. "What are you doing, Promise?" Hecate growled. She was about to get angry and unleash her full fury on the boy, but as she lowered her head and looked into the Promise eyes, who was squatting with his head in his hands, she paused. Because despite the pain, the seriousness in them caught her off guard. Therefore, once Hecate looked into those emerald eyes, she fell into a brief moment of daze, then with a sigh of resignation, she turned around, and without further argument, bound Thetis with a spell. After tying up Thetis, Hecate stood alone, leaning silently against a big tree not far away, her face lost in contemplation. She was thinking about life. Maybe it's time to consider dragging this guy down with me and ending this madness once and for all. Great Goddess Hecate, her broken bar. Thetis spoke softly, still weak from the potion's effects. "Alas, everyone spoils you far too much." Though drugged and tied up, the goddess was weak and powerless. She wasn't really angry. She simply leaned against the Pegasus, who had calmly returned to her side, looked at the young man in front of her, who had obviously made up his mind, and smiled weakly. Hecate, now staring at the sky with a blank expression, opened her mouth as if to protest. She wanted to declare that she did not spoil this guy. In fact, she could even be said to be irreconcilable with him. But given the current situation, her words would hold no weight. So, with a defeated sigh, Hecate closed her eyes, pretending to sleep to avoid the embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Goddess Thetis." A broken bar Promise said as he looked at the tied-up and weak goddess of the sea in front of him. She was Thetis, the sage of the sea, who was recognized as the most virtuous goddess among the gods. Her beauty, as acknowledged by all, was undeniable. One should know that, in Greek mythology, it wasn't just Zeus, the king of gods, who pursued her, but the god of sea, Poseidon, the god of light, Apollo, and even Hermes had launched a fierce pursuit of Thetis. If this were not the case, Zeus would not have issued a death order, forcing everyone not to touch Thetis, and even ask the gods to swear an oath to this end. So, now, as Promise gazed at her, with her elegant figure restrained by magical chains, her body limp from the potion, resting against the snowy white Pegasus, the goddess still smiled warmly, her gentle blue eyes meeting his. Even in this vulnerable state, her charm was overpowering, so much that despite having long built up a resistance to the allure of goddesses, at this moment, Promise found himself gulping. Awkwardly, he shifted his gaze away, however, unfortunately, his eyes locked with Hecate's instead. And the goddess' crimson eyes were filled with clear disdain as she looked at him. "So, the reason you summoned me this time was to help you capture Thetis?" Hecate crossed her arms over her chest and rolled her eyes, saying, "Was all this necessary? You could have just asked Hera. Doesn't she still owe you a marriage? If you like her so much, why don't you just ask Hera to marry her off to you?" Hearing all this, before the boy could respond, Thetis spoke up. "Oh? So, Promise, you like me?" Thetis said, looking at him with a soft, shy smile. "If it's you, I think I could consider it." "That's not it. You misunderstood, Goddess Thetis." Promise quickly tried to explain, but "So, does it mean that you don't like me? Am I really so unlikable?" Thetis pouted, her eyes growing sad, as if deeply hurt. "I suppose it makes sense. After all, you bullied me and tied me up." Her pitiful expression left Promise speechless. However, his earlier nervousness melted into a flat, unimpressed stare as he addressed her. "Respected Thetis, are you sure you're not just Goddess Hestia in disguise right now?" Giggling softly, Thetis replied in a playful tone, "Oh, Promise, what are you talking about?" "I don't understand." Hecate's expression grew more bewildered as she watched. Looking at Thetis, who seemed like a different person in front of Promise, and then looking at the boy again. Of course she recognized Thetis, the sage of the sea, known as the most virtuous goddess, who carried herself with grace and wisdom. The Thetis she knew was an object of desire for countless gods, admired for her beauty and virtue. If it weren't for her noble status and her father being the elder among the sea gods, the first true sea god in ancient Greek mythology, how could Thetis remain pure until now? Considering the attention she garnered, it was quite a miracle. So, were her status and background her only shields in such a dangerous world? In other words, it could be understood this way. There were only two types of goddesses, who were able to survive in the ancient Greek age of gods and remain pure. Either they were so ugly that no one wanted them, or they were strong enough and had a noble status no one dared to offend. Not considering the special cases of the three virgin goddesses Athena, Artemis and Hestia, the best reference was undoubtedly the great goddess Hecate, who has been repeatedly pulled out to work by Promise. This goddess had managed to retain her autonomy by virtue of her strength and status. Those who were both powerful and privileged enough could maintain their purity, but it was a rare occurrence. At the same time, because of this, Hecate understood how special Thetis' attitude towards the boy was. It was one thing to feel comfortable with someone and one thing to feel extremely so. The way she acted around Promise was too different from her usual self. This was quite a mystery worth thinking. No, why is it worth thinking? What does this have anything to do with me? Obviously, there is no connection at all. So, why should I care? Chapter 168. Help me attack Olympus. Obviously, there is no connection at all. So Hecate gave up thinking again. After all, whatever drama Promise was cooking up, it clearly didn't concern her, and that was all she cared about. "Promise, what on earth are you doing now? Why did you ask me to tie up Thetis?" Hecate questioned, still puzzled by the whole situation. "Wait, Hecate, Can't you see what's happening? Promise replied, blinking innocently as he looked at her. He knew that the goddess had some powers over fate. I don't spy on you for fun. It would have been fine if he hadn't mentioned it, but now that he did, Hecate snapped, and her irritation flared up again. Just the mention of fate sent the goddess over the edge. She followed Promise's path and became a miserable worker today. Her biggest mistake was that she peeped at this guy's fate when she saw him for the first time. If she hadn't been so curious that day, taking a few more glances, she wouldn't be stuck in this ridiculous predicament, being dragged into one mess after another. So, from then on, Hecate closed her eyes, and swore off looking into his fate, reasoning that as long as she didn't watch too much or speak too much, it would have nothing to do with her. Oh, it's not a big deal. Promise thought about it for a while, and started speaking slowly as he subtly edged closer to Hecate under Thetis's curious gaze. It's just I need the beautiful, powerful, and noble Hecate to do me a tiny favor. Hey, hearing his words, before Hecate could fully process what was happening, whoosh! Promise had latched onto her arm. I've caught you, Goddess Hecate. You're not getting away this time, he exclaimed, grinning from ear to ear like a child who just caught a prize. Hecate blinked in disbelief, looking at the young man, her initial confusion quickly morphing into terror as she remembered the unpleasant situations Promise had dragged her into before, like that temple filled with heads and the drama with the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. Let me go. Hecate, realizing something was wrong, shrieked, instinctively trying to pull away and run, but Promise had wrapped his arms tightly around her. Let go, Promise. Have you lost your mind? Hecate was on the verge of another breakdown, her voice a mix of panic and fury. Thetis, meanwhile, watched the scene unfold, blinking in surprise. Then, with some curiosity, she turned to the Pegasus nearby, who appeared entirely unfazed. Are they always like this? Looking at her confused yet strange eyes, the latter nodded solemnly. Yup, this is how they always are. Promise, this really isn't the best way to handle things, Thetis said gently, trying to intervene. Even if Goddess Hecate spoils you so much, you shouldn't force her to do things she doesn't like. You hear that, Promise? Stop tormenting me, Hecate cried out, only to snap back in realization. Wait, who said I spoil him? Faced with Hecate's piercing gaze, Thetis remained silent, and just slightly twisted her now weak and tied up delicate body, making the latter embarrassed. But soon returning to the topic, she quickly redirected her attention and glared at Promise. Did you hear that? Let go of me already, Hecate growled, adding, look, even if you wanted to take your revenge on me, haven't you gotten enough of your revenge by now? How long are you planning to hold this grudge? I've done everything you've asked for, now I've even offended the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. Why are you still clinging to me? Well, at first, I did plan on getting a little revenge. Yes, under such circumstances, Promise didn't beat around the bush and simply told the truth and admitted. But now, Goddess Hecate, it's your fault. I just can't do without you anymore. No, do you even know what you are saying? Hecate's face shifted from shock to disbelief as she stared at Promise. Like, are you serious? Even Thetis, who had been observing quietly, had a strange look on her face. Because you're just too useful, Goddess Hecate, Promise explained, flashing an innocent smile. After all, magic is really convenient. From Promise's perspective, this beautiful laid-back goddess in front of him was the perfect assistant to efficient, powerful, and versatile. She was not only the goddess of crossroads and witchcraft in the ancient Greek mythology, but also capable of manipulating magic in ways that others could hardly comprehend. In truth, for Hecate, what people called magic was merely a means of directly materializing her own imagination within the bounds of truth and the scope of her divine authority. To her, it was simply the act of transforming thought into reality, following the framework of universal laws. But one have to know that this wasn't an ordinary universe. This was type Moon. Nasuverse. Take, for instance, the magical chains currently binding Thetis. Promise could tell at a glance that they were a replica of the chains forged by Hephaestus, capable of restraining even gods. Hecate was extremely special. She did not belong to any of the sky, the ocean, or the underworld, but she was respected wherever she went. This status was earned through strength. Her strength lay in her ability to simulate the powers of other gods, even Zeus's lightning if needed. Therefore, in Promise's view, Hecate stood on equal ground with Athena and Hephaestus in terms of her uniqueness and power. There was absolutely no need to talk about Athena, as that goddess of war and wisdom possessed unparalleled wisdom and combat prowess, making her the strongest god in the entire Olympus except Zeus. While his teacher Hephaestus was the type who could forge anything imaginable. Hecate's magic, on the other hand, represented limitless potential, an ability to create miracles. To put it simply, if this world were a game, Promise believed that Hecate, Athena, and Hephaestus would be akin to cheat codes or developers who could alter the game's very rules. So, when he grabbed Hecate and pulled her at the beginning, it was indeed for a little revenge, but after employing her powers a few times, he found himself growing fond of the experience. After all, no matter how impossible or absurd a situation might seem, having her magic on hand was like playing with an all-purpose trump card. And so, what had started as a quest for revenge turned into a dependence on her abilities. No matter the challenge, you can never go wrong by playing the Hecate card. Hecate was utterly speechless. After fully understanding what Promise had in mind, she felt the sudden urge to strangle him. "I'm a goddess, and great goddess. Do you even realize that?" It seems like that's actually the case. Thetis, who was beside them, completely grasped Promise's idea and actually nodded in agreement. Hearing this, Hecate's face darkened completely, and she turned around, wanting to leave. But Promise only hugged her tighter. "No, please, Goddess Hecate. Since you're already here, and we've already tied her up, you might as well help us to the end. I'm begging you, Goddess Hecate." Looking at Promise, who was clinging to Hecate and refusing to let go, and at the exasperated Hecate, Thetis tried hard to stifle her laughter. Then, turning her head slightly to the side, she whispered to Pegasus, "Promise, he didn't act like this with Athena before, did he?" After all, Hecate is a jack of all trades, and apparently so is Athena. Pegasus thought for a moment, then shook its head. It remembered very well that Promise had been quite respectful toward Athena. No, rather than respect, it seemed more like he was afraid of something, which kept him restrained. Afraid of what? Of course, afraid of being choked. Athena is a virgin goddess after all. The most fundamental reason Promise was so reckless with Hecate was, at the core, because of her personality. After all, he knew this woman didn't take things too seriously, and she would never actually strangle him in the future. That's why he was pushing his luck, and trying to commit suicide now. After struggling for a while, Hecate realized she couldn't break free, so she just gave up. Rolling her eyes, she silently vowed to herself that the next time she returned, she'd throw that cursed familiar into the abyss. Then, with a resigned look, she said, "Fine, fine, just stop clinging to me. I'm not running anymore. Now, tell me, what is it this time?" "Well, Goddess Hecate, it's like this." Promise began, ready to explain, but Hecate waved her hand impatiently. Enough, stop. I'm not interested in listening your long-winded explanation, nor do I care about the details. Just tell me what you want to do and what you need me to do. After all, once I finish this job, I'm throwing that familiar into the abyss. Work? To hell with work. Don't even think about seeing me again. Oh, that's simple. Goddess Hecate, I need your help to attack Mount Olympus. Promise said it so casually that Hecate almost went with the flow. Attack Mount Olympus, right? No pro. Wait, what? Chapter 169. Take good care of her. When the night and stars covered the sky, the most ancient primordial goddess of ancient Greece, Nyx, the goddess of night, descended from the night sky and appeared in front the young man who had summoned her. Those eyes, that were as brilliant as the stars, looked at the black-haired, green-eyed youth in front of her as she softly asked with a beautiful smile. "Child, you called for me. Is there something you need my help with?" "Huh?" As she spoke, Nyx blinked, looking in surprise at Hecate, who was sitting lifelessly on a stone on the beach, and said, "Hecate, child, why are you here?" "No, Not that ... You actually came out of the underworld? Saying this, she tilted her head and glanced at the sky, noting with some relief that the heavens hadn't collapsed yet. Esteemed goddess of the night Nyx, may I ask, do you know goddess Hecate? Promise asked curiously. I know Hecate's mother. Hearing this, Nyx smiled as she explained, because this child has been staying in the underworld all year round and never goes out. Her mother entrusted her to me and asked me to help take care of her. As he spoke, she came to Hecate and touched her head lovingly. And Hecate, who had been as prickly as a hedgehog in front of Promise, now actually behaved like a docile child in the presence of the night goddess. This kind of scene greatly surprised the boy. Not only that, goddess Nyx is actually Hecate's protector. At this moment, goddess Thetis, now free from her earlier restraints and back to her gentle demeanor, quietly explained to Promise, in ancient times, it was goddess Nyx who encouraged Hecate to forsake her divine powers and focus on magic. And it was also because of her that Hecate went out of the underworld during the Second War of the Gods to help God King Zeus fight his father. Nyx, the goddess of night, aside from being one of the most ancient deities, held a very special position amongst all the gods. She was the foster mother of the current king of the gods, Zeus. The current god king was able to grow up without being discovered by his father thanks to Nyx, who shrouded him in the cover of night. As Thetis spoke, she glanced at Nyx and then at Promise. Suddenly, everything became clear to her. She now understood why, despite always feeling that the boy was troublesome, Hecate still tolerated him. It turned out that the real key did not come from her student Medea, but from the attitude of the goddess of night towards Promise. Speaking of which, Nyx had always been fond of the boy. Ever since he drew a picture of the night sky as a gift to the moon goddess Artemis, she had quietly helped him on more than one occasion. Sometimes, during the night, she had even brought Promise into her chariot so he could rest peacefully. Goddess Nyx, I really want to go hide in the abyss right now, Hecate muttered, her eyes vacant as she raised her head. She then shocked everyone by saying, why hasn't the world been destroyed yet? Why is the age of gods still not over, yet? Nyx blinked at Hecate's words, then turned her questioning gaze toward Thetis and Promise. Then Thetis and Pegasus quickly turned their eyes to Promise with extraordinary decisiveness, and Pegasus even stretched out his horse's hoof to point at the boy. Did little Promise bully you? Nyx couldn't help but be curious as she observed the situation. Her heart even tingled with anticipation, wanting to know what had happened and what interesting events she had missed. After all, getting Hecate, the goddess who usually stayed home and gave everyone a headache, to come out and even lose her composure was quite a remarkable event, even for the goddess of night. No, she couldn't admit that she had been bullied. After all, she was a goddess, a great goddess, a very powerful one at that. So, Hecate hugged Nyx's waist, burying her face in her arms, and said in a deeply frustrated tone, no, of course I wasn't bullied by him, child. How could I be bullied by a child? It's just I'm emotionally drained and feel like destroying the entire world, dragging everyone down with me. Nyx, finding this amusing, gently stroked Hecate's head while casting a reproachful glance at Promise. Goddess Hecate, I'm sorry. I apologize, Promise said, hesitating for a moment before sincerely offering an apology. There was no point in lying to a god, let alone these particular gods. So, Promise had to say the truth. As he said, I'm sorry, Goddess Hecate. I admit I've been too reckless lately, but I really need your help this time. After all, you're the key to my plan for defeating Athena. I know I'm asking a lot, and to make up for it, I swear to you from now on that I will do everything I can to change the fate of your student Medea and do my best to offer you a gift that will satisfy you and atone for my mistake. Promise hadn't even finished speaking yet. I don't care about offerings, Hecate cut him off with a pout and said, as long as you swear you'll stop bothering me from today onward, I'll help you with all my strength this time. Hearing this, Promise was hesitating, unsure if he should agree or not. After all, at this moment, he had no intention of continuing to trouble Hecate, especially now, seeing how resistant she was. But since the other party had already helped him so much, Promise felt he owed her a debt of gratitude. Just then That won't do. Unexpectedly, Nyx actually spoke up and firmly rejected Hecate on Promise's behalf. As Hecate suddenly looked up with eyes wide open in disbelief, Nyx said, "Although I don't know what's going on, but from the looks of things, you and Little Promise seem to know each other well, so you must have met more than once or twice, right?" "Hecate, I can't even remember the last time you left the underworld." "If your mother knew, she'd probably cry tears of joy." "So, Little Promise, there's no need to be polite to her. You can ask her for help whenever you need it. She's long overdue for getting out and about more." This. While Promise stood there, dumbfounded by this sudden turn of events, Nyx continued. "And besides, you might be able to fool Little Promise and the others, but you still want to fool me." As she spoke, the goddess of night, Nyx, who had been doting on Hecate moments earlier, now smacked her on the head unhappily as she said, "I thought Promise had really bullied you or something, but it turns out he just needed your help." "Little Promise, you don't have to worry about her. If you run into trouble, just go to her. She's not as bothered as she pretends to be. This is all just an act." "Huh?" Hearing this, Promise blinked in surprise, and even Thetis, standing nearby, blinked in astonishment. After all, Hecate certainly didn't seem to be acting. Whether it's a major deity or an ancient god, it doesn't make a difference to her. Nyx casted a sidelong glance at Hecate and explained to them, "Don't be fooled by the casual appearance of this child. She is very proud in her heart. No matter who she crosses and offends, she doesn't care at all. At most, she finds dealing with the affairs of King of the Gods annoying and has to wear a veil all the time when going out. The only reason this child has been resisting you is simply because she finds you annoying. To put it more simply, she just wants to stay at home." Nyx had barely finished speaking, and before the stunned Promise and Thetis could react, Hecate, feeling flustered, quickly retorted, "That's not true." "What do you mean I want to stay home? I'm just deeply focused on my research, fully committed to magic." But as she spoke, she paused slightly and then tilted her head to glance at Promise again. Seeing that the guilt in his eyes had vanished and that Thetis was now rolling her eyes at her, Hecate suddenly became anxious and said, Wait. What's with those looks?" I don't care. Promise, you already apologized to me. You even promised not to cause me any trouble anymore." However, hearing her words, Promise tilted his head thoughtfully as if thinking about it, then glanced at the primordial goddess of night, Nyx, in front of him before smiling slightly. "Don't worry, beautiful goddess Hecate. I swear to the goddess of the night, Nyx, that I will indeed offer you a gift that will bring you joy." Before Hecate, who was still stunned by this sudden turn of events, could react, "Yes." Nyx smiled and clapped her hands and spoke. "All right, Little Promise, I've received your vow. From now on, Hecate is in your care. Please take good care of her." "Don't worry, goddess." Promise gave a bright smile and raised a thumbs up. "I'll definitely take better care of her than anyone else." Chapter 170, "The night will exist for your wish, and the sun shall not rise." Seeing this, even Pegasus, who had been watching the entire show from the sidelines, couldn't help but cast a sympathetic glance at Hecate. "You're done for. You dared to deceive my meticulous, narrow-minded master and got exposed right on the spot. I, Pegasus, would write a big doomed across your legs if I could." No. Hecate wanted to cry out, but had no tears. "He's already been so harsh with me because of what happened with Circe and Medea, and now, Goddess Nyx, you're indulging him even more? How am I supposed to survive like this?" Nyx playfully tapped Hecate on the head again and, with an exasperated tone, said, "It's a good thing to go out more often. If your mother knew, she'd probably cry tears of joy." "How long has it been since you last visited her, anyway? Besides, Little Promise is so adorable. How could he really do anything to harm you?" "By the way, Little Promise, what did you summon me for again?" "Oh, well, esteemed Goddess Nyx, I seek your help in leading us to Storm Mount Olympus." "Ah, I see. Wait, Storm Mount Olympus?" Nyx, who had initially subconsciously nodded in understanding, suddenly snapped her head up, eyes wide in shock as she looked at Promise. "Didn't you say you just needed Hecate's help to mess with Athena?" She had always been keenly aware of Promise's relationship with Athena. So, She simply assumed the two had simply had a falling out, and that Promise had enlisted Hecate's help to mediate between them. But now, what's this about attacking Mount Olympus? Hecate, who was extremely depressed the previous second, was immediately happy at Nyx's reaction. It turns out even you can show this expression sometimes. So, here's the thing, esteemed primordial goddess, Thetis, the goddess of the sea, stepped forward and softly explained everything to Nyx. By the end, she smiled warmly and said, "To be honest, I didn't expect Promise, this child, to have such a bashful yet adorable side. Messing with Athena's plans and defeating her isn't really his goal all. Well, maybe there is a tiny bit of revenge involved," Thetis explained. "But his true intention in doing SP is to save them through this scheme, preventing the mighty king of gods, Zeus, from severely punishing them again." When Thetis finished speaking, even Hecate didn't have much of a reaction. In fact, they had already figured out Promise's motives when he revealed his plan. After all, they weren't just Ania, they were a wise sea goddess and a powerful great goddess. Athena wants to trade an oath of absolute loyalty for 2 of Promise's paintings, but Promise does not want it. Thetis' beautiful blue eyes fell on Promise as she gently continued. He doesn't want them to suffer as a result, and that's his true motivation. Promise planned to stir up a big commotion out of this matter, throwing everything into chaos, using his actions to save Zeus, and using this merit to prevent Athena, Hera, and the others from the severe punishment they might face. Although, it was obvious that when Zeus was eventually rescued, he would only need a single glance to understand Promise's intentions. Yet, even knowing all this, when faced with the fact that Promise would have bested Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Hera, the queen of heaven, and Apollo, the god of the light, in front of the gods, while also being the one to save Hema, the king of the gods, Zeus, despite knowing everything, would still go along with Promise's plan. "So, no need to hide anymore," Thetis said with a smile, clapping her hands and gazing around the small island surrounded by the night sea. "Everyone, who has been waiting for so long, just come out, this way Promise won't have to look for you one by one." Before Promise, who was stunned by the sudden change of events, could react to Thetis' words, suddenly he, Goddess Hestia, you lost. "You still don't understand this little guy Promise as well as I do." Hermes, pressing down his feathered cap, strutted out from the shadows with a smug smile on his face, with the eldest of the gods, Hestia, following behind. Yeah, understand you know Promise very well. But once this matter is over, I'll be telling jealous Hera about this, and let's see how far you can run." Hestia, her pink hair shimmering, grumbled, clearly displeased at losing their bet. "It's just like our dear little Promise, isn't it, Mother?" Persephone, queen of the underworld, clung to her mother Demeter's arm, trying to please her. Demeter gave Persephone a look, then cast a glance toward Hades, who had silently emerged alongside them. With a faintly resentful tone, she said, "Now you want to please me, but you're really just eager to follow him, aren't you? Little Promise, come here, let me hug you. I've missed you so much." The moon goddess Artemis stepped out of the moonlight and rushed toward Promise with excitement. However, seeing her again, Promise was so frightened that his face turned pale, and he quickly ducked behind Thetis. However, Thetis, who's still feeling a bit resentful about having been tied up earlier, simply pushed him back out in front. "The fates really do know you well," said Aphrodite, the goddess of love, her fiery red hair as brilliant as flames. She crossed her arms around her chest and looked at Promise, before speaking. "They said you wouldn't behave, and here you are, proving them right." Standing beside her, the goddess of beauty, was a handsome, red-haired man, clad in battle armor, whom Aphrodite had brought from the mortal realm after searching for a long time. He was wearing a battle armor, and his expression was one of arrogance. "Ha ha ha! War, I crave war," the god boomed. "Attacking Mount Olympus, is it? No problem. I don't know what's going on, but don't worry, leave Athena to me. I'll definitely beat her down." This male god radiated confidence and pride. The other gods, however, pretended not to see him, subtly edging away from him, as if they didn't want to be infected. Given that reaction, There was no need to guess his identity any further. The last of the 12 Olympian gods to make an appearance here, Ares, the god of war. All right, beautiful and noble goddess Artemis, Promise is about to suffocate. Thetis, despite being the one to push him forward, soon regretted it when she saw Artemis clung shamelessly to Promise. So, while speaking in a soft voice, she gently pulled him back without leaving any trace. Before Artemis, the goddess of moon, could express her dissatisfaction, still pouting with puffed cheeks, Thetis, who was holding Promise, motioned for the boy to look around at the gathered gods. It could be said that except for the god of war Ares, who was out of place, all the gods around him were familiar faces. Having heard about what was happening in the divine realm, these gods had gathered here for one reason: they knew Promise was bound to take action. To be honest, even now, I don't agree with your plan, Thetis said softly yet firmly to Promise. After all, this is a matter concerning the gods, something none of us wish to be involved in. It shouldn't fall on the shoulders of a child like you. At this point, her tone grew lighter, though, and with a gentle smile, she added, but I must admit, even if it were me, I couldn't have brought about such a grand scene. All of this, is as beautiful as one of your paintings. With a sigh of faint helplessness, Thetis' voice softened further, so, go on. Go do what you need to do. As she said this, Nyx, the goddess cloaked in night and stars, blinked and immediately gave Hecate, who was still unresponsive, a flick on the head. Something this interesting. I mean, Hecate, you're clearly in the wrong here. How could you refuse such a thing? Hecate, clutching her head, stared blankly at Nyx. You definitely wanted to say interesting, didn't you? Oh, I understand. You completely sold me out to that brat just because you thought it was amusing, right? I can't believe Thetis, so this is what you're really like, goddess of the night. Nyx, however, ignored Hecate's indignant gaze, stepped forward and looked over the assembled gods. Then, with a smile, she raised her hand toward the night sky and declared, the night will conceal your tracks and not even the wise goddess herself will be able to find you. And I, Nyx, the goddess of night, hereby declare, until the imprisoned king of the gods, Zeus, is rescued and the goddess of wisdom is defeated, the night shall remain eternal. The sun will not rise. As the goddess of night, Nyx's proclamation echoed through the island. In the palace of Helios, the sun god suddenly looked up, with a confused look on his face. Huh? Nyx clenched her fist, determined this time. This time, there would be no interruptions. She was going to enjoy this drama to the very end, without missing a moment. Chapter 171, Hades, beat him. The night concealed all traces. And so, the group arrived at the foot of Mount Olympus. After arriving there, as soon as Promise dismounted from Pegasus, just stand still, I need to bless you first. After she finished speaking, before the boy could even react to her words, the black-haired, red-eyed goddess in a black dress gave him a hard kick in the butt. As he turned to glare at her, Hecate raised her chin defiantly and said, what are you looking at? Without a blessing, how do you expect your puny mortal body to survive in the divine realm? I feel like you're taking revenge. Promise muttered. You don't need to feel it, I am. Promise sighed in frustration, looking at the goddess in front of him, who had completely abandoned her dignified demeanor. At this moment, she did not look like a goddess at all. Not only had she given up all pretense, but Hecate was now fully embracing her laid-back attitude. And to think she's supposed to be a great goddess. Promise, what should we do next? Thetis, the gentle sea goddess, watched the two of them staring at each other, in amusement before asking with a smile. Her soft voice also broke the tension. But before Promise could answer a let's go, I'll lead the charge. I'm going to beat Athena into the ground. Ares, the god of war, clad in his battle armor, stepped forward, brimming with excitement. Though he had no idea what was going on, he knew one thing. It was time for carnage. Ares truly didn't know the full story when Aphrodite, the goddess of love, found him following the instructions of the three fates. She didn't even bother explaining. At that time, she simply told him he could fight Poseidon, the god of the sea, Apollo, the god of light, Hera, the queen of heaven, and Athena. Especially Athena, the goddess of wisdom. The moment he heard that he could fight that goddess, Ares immediately became excited and rushed over without stopping. Seeing this, the other gods, who also came with him, instinctively distanced themselves from Ares, as if afraid that they would be affected and his breath or even presence would lower their IQs. Seeing his enthusiasm, Promise blinked, thinking for a moment, then said with a smile, "Don't worry, Honorable Lord Ares. I promise you'll get the chance to have a good, proper fight with Goddess Athena." The moment Promise said this, Ares immediately felt that the young man in front of him was extremely pleasing to the eye. Originally, at the beginning, the god of war hadn't cared much about Promise, who seemed as weak as a newborn. But now, with the promise of a battle, Ares was all in. Laughing loudly, he strode over to Promise, clapping him on the shoulder with enthusiasm. "Ha ha ha, good kid. You must be Chiron's student, Promise, right? Very good. From today onward, I will protect you. If you ever need to fight, just call me." As he spoke, Ares patted Promise's shoulder excitedly. But who was he? The god of war. How could he know how to hold back? With one powerful slap on the shoulder, Promise, despite Hecate's earlier blessing, was nearly flattened. Had it not been for the blessing, he might have blacked out and found himself in the underworld. Or more accurately, back in the modern world. Even with the blessing, Ares' slap on the shoulder directly buried Promise face first into the ground. "Wow, you little kid, why are you so fragile?" Before the surprised Ares could even finish his words, his body instantly tensed. Because, in that moment, he became the absolute focal point of everyone present. Everyone looked at him with hostile eyes, and moon goddess Artemis even had her bow drawn, aiming directly at his head. For once, even the fearless Ares felt a bit flustered at this time. Fortunately, Thetis quickly pulled Promise out of the dirt, while Hecate stood nearby, laughing loudly and without restraint until Nyx, the goddess of night, gave her a good-natured smack on the head. When Promise finally regained his senses, he did not look at the god, who slapped him to the ground with any resentment or whatever. Instead, he looked at Hecate in amazement. After all, he, who was as frail as a flower, was only kicked by her and given him a simple blessing, but he actually survived a slap from the god of war just now. As expected, Hecate, the reluctant employee, was quite reliable, Promise thought with a sense of appreciation. Hecate, who had been laughing just moments ago, abruptly stopped. Though she didn't know exactly what Promise was thinking, a sudden chill ran down her spine, and she shot him a deathly glare. As for what happened next, well, it doesn't need to be said anymore. Soon, the majestic Pegasus unfurled its silver wings once again, carrying Promise high into the sky, flying toward the realm of the gods, the peak of Mount Olympus. At that moment, it felt just like one of the ancient myths. In the original myth, Bellerophon, the hero who tamed Pegasus, became arrogant and prideful, believing he deserved to live among the gods, deserving the same treatment as them. So, he commanded Pegasus to take him to the realm of the gods, only to be thrown off, falling to his doom and losing everything. Promise, too, was now riding atop Pegasus, heading toward the domain of the gods. But unlike Bellerophon, he wasn't driven by arrogance or pride. Although leading a group of Olympian gods to storm their own domain might seem far more outrageous by comparison, but believe him. He had no other motives. Sitting behind him was Goddess Hecate, with a look of despair on her face. She couldn't help but recall how just moments ago, the moon goddess Artemis, Persephone, and Demeter had all been vying for the seat behind Promise, and how she, who had been merely watching the show, was suddenly grabbed by the goddess of night and forced to sit here. The hostile looks from the other goddesses that followed. Hecate now had half a mind to strangle Promise. "Are you catnip for goddesses or something?" "Sure, I'm not afraid of them, and if I've provoked them, so be it. But this is so annoying." "Okay." However, despite the clear look of displeasure on their faces, none of the goddesses could argue against Hecate taking that seat. After all, what lay ahead was a civil battle between the Olympian gods, with Athena and Poseidon among the strongest forces. Once the fighting started, even the smallest shockwaves could easily send Promise straight to the underworld. So, apart from Hecate, no one else could be confident to protect Promise in the chaos that was about to unfold. Goddess Hecate. As Pegasus soared toward the divine realm, Promise suddenly called out to Hecate. However, the latter completely ignored him, merely looking up at the sky. Promise didn't care and continued his questioning with curiosity. By the way, if you were to fully empower Lord Ares, would he stand a chance against Goddess Athena? In the Holy Grail War of Fuyuki City, Hecate's student Medea had once enhanced an ordinary school teacher to the point where he could fight heroic spirits head-on. And judging by that slap from Ares earlier, it was clear that while this goddess might be unreliable in personality, her power was undeniable. No chance, Hecate replied without even turning her head. Even with a boost, he'd still lose. Though he might last longer before getting beaten. In ancient Greek mythology, there was an infamous account from the Trojan War. During the conflict, the god of war Ares once fought with Athena because he couldn't stand losing. The outcome? Athena kicked Ares to the ground and proceeded to pummel him, pinning his face to the earth. Just as Promise was nodding, wearing a look of unsurprised realization, Hecate suddenly seemed to remember something. She finally shifted her gaze toward him, narrowing her red eyes slightly. I just recalled something. Ares wasn't part of your original plan, was he? It was the three goddesses of fate who guessed what you were going to do and brought him to you. And earlier, you said I was the only one who could do it, or that I was the key to defeating Athena. Her eyes gleamed with suspicion as she asked, so, kid, tell me, were you planning to use me as a punching bag from the very start? Why does a goddess have to be so smart? Being too smart makes it hard for people to like you. Promise didn't answer, but Hecate smiled. In that moment, her smile was breathtakingly beautiful. Then, without warning, she reached out and clamped her hand around his neck. Ugh, I can't take it anymore. Promise, why don't you just hurry up and die already? Just die, die, die. If you don't, I swear I'll go insane. If you push me any further, I'll destroy the whole world. Cough, cough, Promise wheezed, trying to loosen her grip. Easy, easy. If you squeeze any harder, I really will die. And wow, Goddess Hecate, you must really like me. You're willing to destroy the entire world just because of me. I'm so touched. Pegasus, head down, continued running steadfastly, acting as if nothing was happening on its back, completely oblivious to the antics of the bickering human and goddess. The most he did was sigh inwardly. It's really not easy. Finally, there's a goddess who sincerely wants the young master to die. It's been a long time coming. As Hecate sat behind the boy, not wanting to care about him and seriously contemplating the possibility of severing her master-student relationship with Medea, Pegasus finally took them both to the highest point of the sacred Mount Olympus. With ease, they passed through the barrier separating the mortal world from the divine realm. Upon entering the divine realm, what greeted Promise wasn't a grand, majestic sight. Instead, what stretched out before him was a vast ocean that covered everything. Poseidon, wielding his trident, had flooded the entire domain of Olympus. At this very moment, Hades, the god of the underworld, Persephone, Demeter, and other gods stood before him. Hades. Poseidon's face was twisted in fury as he said, I never imagined you would leave the underworld and come here to help Zeus. Hearing Poseidon's words, Hades remained silent, not bothering to explain that he was not here because of Zeus and his presence here was solely due to Promise. After all, Hades had never been one for many words. On the other hand, Demeter's anger flared the moment she laid eyes on Poseidon. She recalled her original fate Hera had once revealed to her after Hades' wedding, the grim memory of how, in her grief over losing Persephone, she had wandered the mortal realm, only to be captured by Poseidon, who had been spying on her for a long time. In the end, even after transforming into a mare, she couldn't escape. Hades, you want to take Persephone? Fine, I'll allow it. Demeter, seething with rage, didn't waste time on pleasantries. If you can beat Poseidon to the ground, I will give you my daughter. Comment 23. Vote to left. Chapter 172, Fight begins. The fight has begun. When she said this, Persephone, who had been standing by with wide eyes, didn't know what to say for a moment. Sure, she was happy about the prospect of returning to the underworld with Hades, but the idea of being traded off by her mother like Theseus. What was going on? Hearing this, Hades, who was already highly motivated, now had a literal fire burning in his eyes. Poseidon, on the other hand, was startled by the sudden intensity of his brother's determination. Hecate, who happened to arrive in the divine realm, looked down on the Pegasus and saw this scene. Thinking that Hades, ruler of the underworld, technically her boss. Not that she particularly cared. After all, she had always disregarded the rules of the underworld, freely traveling between the mortal realm and the land of the dead. Even Cerberus, the fearsome hound of the underworld, was her pet. Still, since she did reside in his domain, she might as well help out. So, she cast a strengthening spell on Hades, ensuring he could beat Poseidon even hard. Thus began the battle between the two titanic figures of Greek mythology, the Lord of the Underworld and the Lord of the Seas. Their immense divine powers and authorities clashed, causing the waters within the divine realm to churn violently, sending waves crashing everywhere. The sheer force of their confrontation began to affect not only the godly realm but also the world outside. Seeing this, Nyx, the goddess of night, exerted her full power, extending the night's veil to cover the area, enveloped the realm in darkness, and ensuring that the battle wouldn't spill over and threaten the entire world. Even Hecate became serious, pulling out her staff to cast protective magic over Pegasus and Promise as they ventured deeper into the heart of the divine battlefield. "Let's go, brother Pegasus," Promise whispered to Pegasus, his earlier playful demeanor gone as he shifted into a more focused state. Hearing this, the latter nodded quietly and pressed forward. Despite the winged horse's usual habit of selling promise to many goddesses and then retreating to graze, when it truly mattered, Pegasus never faltered. No matter if it was the underworld or the realm of the gods, wherever Promise wished to go, it would descend from the starry night sky to carry him to his destination. Meanwhile, in the magnificent, gilded halls of Olympus. Looks like the fighting has started. Hermes pressed down the feathers on his cap, with a sly smile at the corners of his mouth as he turned his gaze toward Apollo, the god of light, in front of him. "It looks like it's our turn to get started, don't you think, Artemis?" As he spoke, he shifted his attention to the moon goddess standing beside him. Artemis nodded without hesitation, immediately drawing her bow and aiming it straight at Apollo. "Is this really necessary?" The latter sighed, clearly exasperated. "I didn't even want to get involved. I just got here a little late." "And Hermes, don't think I don't know what this is about. You're just looking for an excuse to get back at me for hunting you last time, right?" "Oh my, Apollo, whatever are you talking about?" "I have no idea what you mean," Hermes responded with a look of confusion, and eyes wide in mock surprise, though the grin on his face betrayed his amusement. "Oh, by the way, Artemis," Hermes continued, "that kid Promise gave us strict orders to make sure you utterly defeat Apollo. He wants him humiliated, so, no holding back, got it?" "Got it," Artemis nodded seriously, her eyes gleaming with determination. "For the sake of Promise, I will beat him so hard that he can't even get up." "That's the spirit." At this moment, Hermes couldn't control the smug expression on his face as he grinned from ear and ear and shouted, "Beat him!" Hermes, Apollo, barely dodging one of Artemis' arrows, was livid. "I'll remember this vengeance." "Just you wait." "Oh, please." Hermes didn't buy it at all and said with a dismissive wave, "You're not Promise. What good does holding a grudge do? Now stand still and take your punishment." As the fight erupted between Artemis and Apollo, Hecate's eyes gleamed with excitement. Seeing the moon goddess and the god of light in battle, she couldn't resist. She tossed another enhancement spell their way, making the fight even more intense. Goddess Hecate, Promise, who saw all of this, muttered, watching her with an odd expression. "You're always so unwilling and annoyed, Buta Broken Bar. Are you sure you're not actually enjoying yourself? You seem to be having a great time, right?" In fact, Promise's suspicion wasn't without basis. Hecate had been raised by Nyx, the mischievous night goddess. After all, how could she not have been influenced by her? Besides, if Hecate really resisted from the bottom of her heart, how could she be caught and dragged along by Promise, even allowing him to carry her? She might be unreliable at times, but in the end, she was still a great goddess. Nonsense. Hecate opened her eyes wide. "You are slandering. Promise didn't say anything else and silently noted the matter down in his heart. After all, he still needed her help now, and it wouldn't be too late to settle the account after this was over. As Pegasus carried Promise and Hecate forward, they arrived above the grand temple of Hera. The regal goddess of Promise's very own patron deity was already standing at the entrance, waiting. All the other gods, nymphs, and spirits within the realm of the gods had long fled before the battle began. Hera, with her elegant curls spilling from beneath her crown, gazed at the approaching figures with her amber eyes, calm and poised as ever. Beside her stood Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and her elder sister, Hestia. At that moment, someone else entered the scene, pushed forward by Hestia herself, a goddess seated in a wheelchair. My esteemed and revered mother, the goddess, who was like Hera's girlhood, appeared in front of Hera, sitting in a wheelchair. Half of her face was hidden behind a mask as she gazed up at Hera with an unnaturally bright smile. It's been such a long time, hasn't it? This was Promise's cheap goddess teacher, the child of Hera herself, and widely known as the ugliest of the gods, of a god of the forge, Hephaestus. When Pegasus arrived at the scene, carrying Promise and the others, and they saw the scene below, everyone except for Promise couldn't help but laugh. Even Hecate, Nyx, and Pegasus found the situation amusing. After all, this lineup was simply too interesting. The deep tension between Hera and Hephaestus needed no explanation, and their complicated ties to Promise were even more apparent. The goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, under Hera's command, had been married to Hephaestus, meaning Hephaestus was still technically her husband. As Promise stared down at the scene, his scalp tingling, he noticed Hestia, the one goddess unrelated to the drama below, waving at him with a smile. It was obvious that this pink and black guy had deliberately piled them together. Let's go, Promise urged Pegasus, desperate to leave the area. Oh, come on, stay a bit longer. Aren't you going to say hello to your goddess teacher and your goddess? Hecate seized the chance to tease Promise relentlessly. Pegasus, meanwhile, refused to budge, seemingly entranced by the grass below, as if it were the most appetizing thing in the world. It wasn't until Promise kicked him that the winged horse reluctantly started moving again. As a shooting star streaked across the sky, Hera looked up, watching Promise and his group fly off. Then, turning her gaze back to the goddesses before her, she paused for a moment, deep in thought. And then, to everyone's surprise, she actually smiled at this moment. Let's go, Hera said softly, turning around and adding, let's witness together how that boy will defeat the flawless goddess of wisdom. Chapter 173, Take My Love, My Goddess. The Pegasus ran across the sky above the Olympus gods, carrying Promise and the goddess Hecate. Below, what was once the grand realm of the gods had been swallowed by water. Poseidon, the god of the seas, wielded his trident with all his might, not only to combat Hades, the god of the underworld, but also to suppress Zeus, preventing the king of the gods from breaking free of his bonds. The sea had become Poseidon's domain, where he held the upper hand. Even though they were far away, thanks to the blessing Hecate had bestowed on him, Promise could clearly see the figure standing on the temple steps at the edge of the ocean. A goddess in a pure white gown, holding a spear and shield. Those beautiful golden eyes looked at everything in front of them without the slightest fluctuation. Despite the battles raging between the Olympian gods, where old grudges were being settled and revenges were being taken, and despite Promise's plans being disrupted and taking a different direction altogether, everything covered by the veil of night cast by Nyx to protect the mortal world from disaster, this flawless goddess still stood there, without any wavering, as if she still had everything under control. Even when she sensed Promise's gaze upon her, Athena looked up and offered him a serene, graceful smile, picturesque Athenian smile. At that moment, Thetis, the wise sea goddess clad in a light blue gown, and Ares, the god of war in his armor, arrived in front of her. Goddess of wisdom. I'm sorry. I was persuaded by that boy. Thetis looked at Athena with a slightly complicated expression, but soon she became firm and said, it's too late now. Please step aside. Why are you talking so much nonsense? Ares, the god of war, jumped out and looked at Athena with an impatient expression as he laughed and said, come on, Athena, I've been waiting for this opportunity for too long. I've long wanted to rub your face on the ground and listen to your melodious screams. By that time, let's see if you can still keep this stinky face every day." Upon hearing this, Thetis looked at Ares strangely, because she clearly remembered that in her memory, Athena had not done anything excessive to Ares. So, for a moment she was a little confused about where his anger towards Athena came from. The truth, however, was simple. Ares just didn't like Athena, because every time he saw Athena, even if Athena herself didn't realize it, Ares still felt that this guy was looking at him as if he was a clown. Furthermore, Athena's birth had taken some of his dominion over war, which only fueled his resentment. Despite Ares' foul mouth and the presence of Thetis, the goddess, however, Athena still didn't care about Ares' foul mouth or Thetis, the goddess who had rescued the king of gods Zeus in the original myth. She lifted her head, casting her gaze toward the boy on Pegasus, high above. She smiled, her golden eyes filled with anticipation. "Ah, my dear child, what kind of surprise will you bring me this time?" Yuga Broken Bar. She really does have an infuriating air about her, doesn't she? It was not Promise who said this, but Hecate, who was sitting beside him. As she looked at the goddess below who remained calm in the face of such a situation, Hecate couldn't help but nodded, speaking to Promise. "I think I understand now why you wanted to slap her." Promise, however, didn't respond immediately. His emerald eyes met Athena's gaze for a long moment. And then he smiled. "She's looking forward to this, even with things turning out like this. If that's the case, how could I ever disappoint a goddess I respect so much?" The boy said this with a chuckle, but there was no smile in his eyes. "Goddess Hecate, could you make the moonlight shine upon this place?" Hecate glanced at Promise, who had actually used the word please for a moment but said nothing. Instead, she lifted her head toward the sky and waved her hand. In an instant, the night sky came alive with shimmering stars, and a full moon appeared, its radiant light bathing the landscape. "Now, let the sun shine as well," Promise said again. "You ask, I deliver." Hecate was depressed in her heart, but her body was very obedient. She pulled out her staff and performed magic seriously. Soon, an artificial sun rose opposite the moon, illuminating the entire Olympus. For the first time, the sun and moon hung together in the sky, casting their combined light over the divine realm. Facing such a magnificent sight, even Hades and Poseidon, who were fighting fiercely, and were probably the only ones fighting ruthlessly, stopped for a moment, gazing upward in confusion at Pegasus soaring below the sun and moon. "Whoa, Hecate, you can really make a sun," even though it was his idea. Seeing it actually happen, Promise couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. After all, he had suggested it on a whim, because he suddenly thought of the temple of Hecate in the underworld, where there was always a small sun hanging. Hecate shot him a blank look and turned her head away, not wanting to talk to him anymore. Promise, however, wasn't bothered at all. He kept his smile as he locked eyes with the flawless goddess below, Athena. And then, "Apollo, the noble and radiant god of light, please listen to my prayers here. By the vow witnessed by the gods, which cannot be broken, grant me the bow formed from the power of light." Promise offered his prayer to Apollo, the god of light. The vow he referred to was an unbreakable, and Apollo, due to the incident with the seven-stringed lyre, was bound to never refuse a request from Promise. In the same way, beautiful and noble moon goddess, Artemis, hear my prayer. By the vow witnessed by the gods, which cannot be broken, grant me the arrow formed from the power of the moon. Similarly, Artemis, because of a prior gift she had received, the offering that had lit the night sky, was also bound to never refuse a request from Promise. Meanwhile, Hermes, who had been gleefully teaming up with Artemis to beat up Apollo, was caught off guard by the sudden prayers. Before he could react, he was kicked aside by Apollo and Artemis, who were now focused on Promise's request. The two deities looked at each other for a moment before stepping forward, each emerging from their respective domains of light and moonlight, and approaching Promise, who still sat atop Pegasus. Apollo, smiling, handed his radiant golden bow to Promise. Artemis, likewise, passed him the arrow formed from moonlight. Seeing this scene, Hecate's eyes twitched wildly. In the end, with a resigned sigh, She clicked her tongue and helplessly mustered up her full strength, throwing every possible enhancement she could onto Promise, stacking spell after spell. She even tossed a few onto Pegasus for good measure before hopping off and floating in the air. As a final touch, she gave the horse a swift kick. Pegasus, understanding immediately, spread its majestic wings and under the watchful gaze of all the gods in Olympus, soared higher into the sky, carrying Promise with it. They flew up and up, until they reached the point where the sun and the moon hung in parallel in the heavens. At that moment, the moon and light, the authority and power of the two main gods, began to converge on the boy. "Let's not fight for now," Hades said, putting away his weapon. Poseidon gave him a sideways glance but soon followed suit, putting away his trident. "Wait a minute, Broken Bar, you didn't come here for Zeus at all, did you? You came for that kid, didn't you?" Poseidon realized the reason, a bit belatedly. Of course Poseidon knew Promise, whether it was from the incident with the Temple of the Skull or the time he helped hunt down Hermes. Poseidon still held a favorable opinion of the boy. Hades, not bothering to hide anything, nodded. "After all, there was no need to pretend." "Zeus? Who even is that?" "I'm not familiar with him at all." "So Broken Bar, what's that kid doing now?" Looking at the grand spectacle in front of him, Poseidon couldn't help but continue asking curiously. He really was going to slap Athena. Next to Queen Hera and god of craftsmen Hephaestus, the goddess of beauty Aphrodite looked strange as she witnessed this scene. "She deserves to be beaten." Hera nodded. "You deserve a beating." Hephaestus snorted. Wait a minute, Hephaestus. I remember that you and Athena have always had a good relationship. You are a pair of good friends, right?" Hestia couldn't help but glance at Hephaestus, in amusement. She was actually fully siding with Promise in this situation. In this case, how could Zeus, the king of gods who was imprisoned in the temple behind Athena, not see the magnificent scene happening outside, with only a wall between them? Even Zeus, in his current predicament, lifted his head to look toward the young man, now at the center of attention, soaring through the skies of Olympus. And then, Promise knocked the moonlit arrow, drawing back the bow of light and aiming it directly at the flawless goddess below. "Goddess Athena, this is an arrow filled with all the love from someone who's long admired you." At this moment, Promise was still smiling. As the bow was drawn tighter, the incompatible divine powers of Apollo and Artemis clashed violently within his body, so despite the blessings Hecate had poured into him, it felt like his body was being torn apart. Yet, Promise paid no mind to the pain. His laughter echoed across Olympus, reaching the ears of all the gods. "So no cheating, no blocking it with that shield, beautiful goddess Athena. You must take this honestly and properly." With those words, Promise pulled the bowstring to its full draw in a breath. In that moment, the collision and fusion of the two gods' powers caused the seas below. Despite Poseidon's efforts to control Thema to surge uncontrollably, high above, the sun and moon trembled and flickered, on the verge of vanishing altogether. Seeing the situation spiraling out of control, Hecate also had no choice, as she frantically urged her divine power and authority, and used all the divine power accumulated over hundreds of years at this moment. At her side, two manifestations of Hecate appeared. One was a child, dressed in a black gown, and the other, a fully matured woman, also clad in dark robes. Hecate, being one of the ancient Greek goddesses, embodied the triple goddess archetype: goddess of crossroads, magic, and the moon, with three forms representing different aspects of her power. One form focused on maintaining the sun, the other on sustaining the moon, while Hecate herself worked tirelessly to balance the two divine forces within Promise, ensuring he didn't explode under their weight. Only then did the boy, who seemed to be about to disappear at any time due to the power of the two main gods, finally shot the arrow with great difficulty. An arrow forged from the combined powers of Apollo, the god of light, and Artemis, the goddess of the moon. The moment it was released, the overwhelming divine force immediately dispersed the two manifestations of Hecate. The sun and moon that had appeared in the divine realm shattered in an instant. Only the night, cast by Nyx, remained. Therefore, seeing this arrow, even Zeus, the king of gods who was imprisoned in the temple, was moved. Athena, the flawless goddess with her golden eyes, finally showed a flash of surprise as she instinctively raised her shield, prepared to block the incoming attack until the words of the boy echoed in her ears. "This arrow carries all my heavy love for you, my goddess." Under the gaze of the gods, Athena slowly lowered her shield. Not only did she let go of her shield, but she even discarded her spear. She gazed at the boy high in the sky, shaking her head, a smile of resignation and affection crossing her face. Then, without hesitation, she stood and walked toward the arrow that was heading straight for her. And so, in full view of all the gods, this flawless goddess allowed herself to be consumed by the light of the arrow that the boy had shot. Chapter 174, Zeus inviting for a dinner. A long silence followed. When the vast sea, stirred by Poseidon's power, finally calmed, and the blinding light faded away, Athena finally appeared before the gods who had been waiting for a long time. At that moment, expressions of shock crossed the faces of every deity present: Hera, Zeus, and even Nyx, who watched from the shadows of the night. Because the goddess who had shown strength, wisdom, and seemed perfect since her birth, now appeared before them in a miserable state that she had never shown before, the state that even the gods could not imagine. Her once pristine white gown was tattered, her body bruised and wounded. Though she stood tall, barely managing to maintain her composure, golden ichor, the blood of the gods, trickled from the corner of her lips. The gods were all stunned. Time seemed to freeze as they tried to process what they were seeing, and when they finally snapped out of their shock, their eyes instinctively shifted toward the sky, toward the boy who had released this world-shaking arrow. Unfortunately, Promise did not see this scene that shocked the gods, because the moment the arrow was shot, he had fainted. Not only him, Pegasus, too, had collapsed from exhaustion, both of them falling from the sky like spent shooting stars. Fortunately, Hecate, who had been focused on watching Promise the entire time, managed to catch them both before they could crash into the sea and drown. Holding the unconscious boy in her arms, with Pegasus lying beside them in midair, Hecate's anger boiled over. She was so frustrated that she could barely stop herself from biting him a few times to vent her anger. After all, not did the divine power she had accumulated over centuries got drained in an instant, but her two manifested forms were so damaged that it was unknown whether she'd be able to call them forth again. Even if she had gone down to battle Athena herself, she would definitely not be as miserable as she was now. Athena wouldn't have gone all out against her, after all. And yet, she had to protect this guy, as delicate as a flower, as he unleashed an arrow infused with the power of two major gods. She had to ensure that he survived, preferably without too many injuries. The difficulty of such a task was almost beyond comprehension. It was roughly equivalent to taking the first blood of Promise, and then stop the goddesses, who adored this guy like flowers of the divine era, from hunting her down to the ends of the earth. After checking Promise's condition with her remaining divine power and confirming he wasn't in any mortal danger, Hecate finally breathed a sigh of relief. Only then did she have the time to look up at Athena. Looking at the flawless goddess, now in such a state of disgrace. Wow, that was a hard slap. As Hecate thought about it, the frustration in her heart finally began to ease. After taking a few more glances at Athena's disheveled state, she even started to feel like maybe this whole ordeal wasn't such a loss after all. Athena, on the other hand, paid no mind to the gods around her who were staring at her disheveled appearance. She stood there with raised eyebrows for a while, and soon recovered. Then Athena relaxed her brows, took a deep breath, spat the divine blood in her mouth on the ground, took a step forward, and came in front of Hecate, who was still holding the unconscious Promise. Despite her torn white dress, the goddess of wisdom appeared as flawless as ever, and standing next to Hecate in her all-black attire, the two goddesses seemed like perfect opposites of black and white, light and shadow. Athena's golden eyes softened as she looked at Promise, still unconscious in Hecate's arms. "Is he all right?" Athena asked softly, as if afraid of disturbing him. "He's fine," Hecate replied, her tone dripping with exasperation. "I think he'll probably wake up soon." Saying this, Hecate couldn't hide the frustration in her voice. "Good," Athena breathed a sigh of relief, then looked at Hecate with her golden eyes and said, "Thank you." Before Hecate could respond, Athena turned and walked back to her previous spot. In an instant, her tattered dress repaired itself, once again appearing pristine. She picked up her spear and shield, her gaze sweeping over the gathered gods. Finally, her eyes locked onto Ares, the god of war. And then Athena picked up her gun and raised her shield, and charged towards Ares decisively. A thunderous crash echoed through the divine realm. Whether Ares had time to react or not didn't matter. She had already tackled him to the ground anyway. Then the sound of dong 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 resounded throughout the entire divine realm. Athena waved her fist wildly, hitting Ares in the face. "You wanted to fight, didn't you?" Yelling between punches. "Come on, don't just lie there, fight back." "Hit me, you idiot." The other gods, watching from a distance, exchanged glances as the sound of Athena's fists colliding with Ares' face echoed throughout the realm. Somewhere in the background, Hermes had picked up a stone and casually tossed it at Apollo, striking him square inches the face. "Hermes, you're asking for it," Apollo yelled, immediately chasing after Hermes in a rage. The moon goddess Artemis tilted her head, and just as she looked at Apollo running away, her face full of hesitation. "Not going after them?" a voice asked from beside her. Hestia, who was dressed in pink and black, said to him with a smile, "Hey, I remember that kid Promise seemed to have told you to catch Apollo, didn't he?" "Oh, right. Catch and beat him." Artemis came back to her senses, looked at Hestia with gratitude, and then immediately sprinted after Apollo. The goddess of agriculture Demeter also came back to her senses at this time and glanced at Poseidon, the god of the sea, who was watching the show nearby. Looking at him, she couldn't help but recall the vision of her future being turned into a horse. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. Without a second thought, Demeter sneaked up behind Poseidon and delivered a swift, vengeful kick, sending him crashing into the sea. "Hades, why are you just standing there? Get in there and beat him up if you want my daughter. Mother, I've tolerated you long enough. You're not even hiding it anymore. You've literally sold me out, haven't you?" And so, just as the realm had briefly quieted down following Promise's collapse, it was soon filled with commotion once again. For a moment, Queen Hera, god of forging Hephaestus, and goddess of beauty Aphrodite suddenly felt that they seemed to be a little bit out of place. "How about, let's fight too?" Hermes ran away, and the responsibility of adding fuel to the fire naturally fell on Hestia. Looking at Hestia, who was smiling unscrupulously in front of them, the three goddesses rolled their eyes at her. "Well, we're already here, might as well." Hephaestus, seated in her wheelchair, said with a serious expression, and then with a sharp snap, she pulled out an iron chain, stretching it taut between her hands. Her face was serious, but with an uncontrollable smile in her eyes. She looked at Hera, whose expression changed instantly when she saw what it was. Wait, what is that?" "Put that down." "Put it down, I say," Hera screamed, her dignified composure vanishing as memories of past incidents flashed through her mind. Meanwhile, Aphrodite pondered for a moment, her mind drifting to the vision she had seen through the magic of fate of the little girl she had glimpsed there. In the end, Aphrodite turned away and quietly moved behind Hephaestus, lowering her head to avoid looking at him. Then, without a word, she began pushing her wheelchair, chasing after the screaming Hera as they raced around the divine realm. Meanwhile, high above in the night sky, Nyx, the goddess of night, could barely contain herself. She was laughing so hard at the scene below that she nearly lost her breath. The chaos continued for some time, with gods settling their grudges and brawling, until finally, Promise stirred and opened his eyes. As soon as he opened his eyes, he took a deep breath. The pain coursing through his body felt like he had suffered a full body fracture, so overwhelming that he almost passed out again. Gritting his teeth and enduring the pain, Promise managed to sit up. As he took in his surroundings, he realized he was lying right outside Athena's temple. On the steps nearby, Hecate was on the steps, watching the show with her cheek propped up. "You're awake," Hecate said, without turning to look at him. "When you're ready, just walk in on your own." Upon hearing her words, a confused Promise was about to ask what was going on when he noticed the ground shaking slightly and the sound of something pounding, almost like metal being hammered. He instinctively turned his head in the direction of the noise, only to see Athena still pummeling Ares into the ground, punched Ares in the face one after another, like a relentless blacksmith. Promise blinked, then retracted his gaze, looking at Hecate again. He was subconsciously preparing to ask her about the details. "I'd advise you not to ask any questions right now," Hecate said in a warning tone. "Just go into the room and put an end to this madness. Otherwise Broken Bar, that calm goddess over there, might really catch you and give you a spanking. Who knows, she might even lock you up for good." Hecate said something so horrible that Promise felt a chill run down his spine, especially since Athena didn't even deny her terrifying words. Cough. At this moment, the gentle goddess Thetis also came over, gently touched his head, hesitated for a long time, clenched her fist to cheer Promise up, and said, "You can do it. Don't do this, I'm scared." With Thetis' assistance, Promise struggled to his feet, wincing from the pain. Gritting his teeth, he slowly made his way toward the temple's grand doors, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he approached the door, all the gods who had been brawling outside fell silent. It was as though time had stopped, as the entire divine realm seemed to hold its breath, watching as the boy stepped up to the temple doors. Taking a deep breath, he braced himself, then pushed the doors open with a forceful shove. The moment he entered the room and the doors closed behind him, time seemed to pass again, and the divine realm fell into chaos once again. Inside, Promise had imagined countless ways his first encounter with this particular god might go. The most important god in the Greek mythology, the king of gods, Zeus. He had thought of every possible scenario, but none of them had prepared him for the sight before him. There, standing by the large floor-to-ceiling window, completely free from his previous bonds, was Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods. The window offered a view of the gods' fight outside under the night sky, and in front of him was a dining table with candles lighting the room. There, he stood, with a glass of fine wine in his hand, smiling as he turned to face Promise, the boy he had been waiting for. "Would you like a drink?" and raised his glass, sending an invitation for the stiff boy to join him at the candlelight dinner in the heart of the night. Comment 20. Vote to left. Chapter 175, The Prophecy of the Curtain Falling. How could one describe the god standing before him? He was Zeus, after all, so naturally he was handsome, with white hair and golden eyes. He didn't look the least bit disheveled or like someone who had been imprisoned. And looking the young man in front of him, who had broken into the kingdom of gods and created such a noisy and magnificent theater, disrupting everything he had originally planned, the king of gods Zeus was not angry at all. In fact, there wasn't even a trace of condescension in his gaze. In the dim glow of the candlelight, Zeus smiled softly, holding a glass of wine in his hand and looking at Promise, as if he were welcoming an old friend who had finally arrived after a long journey. In fact, Zeus was quite familiar with this young man. After all, over the past 2 years, Promise's actions in this era had been more than just active, they were nearly legendary. Still, despite his pain, Promise managed to force himself to stand and, step by step, approached Zeus, bowing respectfully once he was close enough. Zeus's golden eyes gleamed as they studied the boy, and after a moment, he smiled and said, "It seems the other's descriptions of you are right. You are delicate, like a flower. Yet, you possess qualities that even the goddess of justice, Themis, couldn't help but acknowledge, tilting the scales of judgment in your favor." He paused, then continued with a light chuckle, "This leaves us unable to harbor any dislike toward you. Instead, we feel only boundless affection." As he spoke, Zeus gestured for Promise to sit down across from him, continuing, "So, child, there is no need for fear. I've been aware of everything you've done since you left the mountain. You are my wife's most loyal follower, my daughter's dearest hero, and, moreover, Broken Bar, you have helped me more than once." To be honest, it wasn't that unusual for Zeus to have a good impression of the boy. After all, even if the initial passion was gone, it was great to know that the person he had once loved were actually protected by Promise, and had even gained Hera's forgiveness. And more than one goddess, how could he not feel some affection for the boy? Yet, as Promise looked at Zeus, who smiled gently at him, he remained calm and composed. In fact, The kinder Zeus seemed, the more composed Promise became. After a broken bar, Zeus, please stop being so nice. It's freaking me out. I'd rather you glare at me with anger or disdain. I could handle that. But this soft, kind look you're giving me is making me want to turn around, go back out, and fight Athena for another 100 rounds and die. I'd rather die than deal with this. But, O glorious king of the goddess, I have rashly entered the kingdom of the gods without your permission. Please, forgive my transgression, Promise said respectfully, trying to maintain his composure, though inside he was screaming, Zeus, please act a bit more normal. Though come to think of it, what's normal for Zeus anyway? The normal Zeus, well, would he be really Zeus? It's no matter. After all, you came here to rescue me, didn't you? Zeus said, his golden eyes taking a deep look at the boy in front of him. With just that single glance, Promise knew that Zeus had seen right through his intentions. But this was no surprise, as he had already expected such outcome. After all, the other party was Zeus. So, Promise did not panic, and replied in a steady voice, nevertheless, a wrong is still a wrong. As a mere mortal, I entered your realm without an invitation and deserve punishment. As these words left Promise's lips, Zeus finally looked at the boy in front of him with a hint of strangeness in his eyes. He originally thought that his meeting with him would not bring him much surprise. After all, over the past 2 years, he'd heard so much about Promise that it had nearly become tiresome, so he had initially assumed he knew everything there was to know about this boy. But in that moment, Promise had piqued his curiosity again, making Zeus take another long look at him. Looking at this delicate boy who looked like a poet or a gentle painter than a hero, Zeus's eyes softened even further and his voice became even more gentler as he soared, child, you realize what an extraordinary feat you've just accomplished? You've even fulfilled one of my heart's long-held wishes. You've shattered her perfection, freeing me from the constant worry and fear I've had for her. That wasn't my strength. Promise shook his head and said, I merely borrowed the powers of 2 esteemed deities, and it was only with the assistance of the great goddess Hecate that I was able to succeed at all. Moreover, if it hadn't been for that final statement where Promise declared that the arrow symbolized his heavy love for Athena, he couldn't have done nothing. After all, Athena, the goddess representing wisdom, was naturally not stupid. How could she take the blow with her face? She would have blocked it with her shield long ago. But no matter how it happened, the result is undeniable, Zeus continued. My flawless daughter was defeated by a broken bar, and who could have imagined that the perfect Athena would one day fall to the very child she cherishes the most? Ha ha ha. Having said that, Zeus could no longer hold back and burst into laughter. He took a few big gulps of the wine, and it was obvious that he was very satisfied with what had just happened. So, child, you need not bear any burden. I, Zeus, King of Olympus, hereby forgive all of your actions and recognize the greatness of your achievements on this journey. Therefore a broken bar, Zeus, still laughing heartily and full of satisfaction, looked at the young man before him and said, speak your wish, and whatever it may be, I will do my best to fulfill it. Upon hearing this, just as Promise lifted his head to respond, Zeus interrupted him with a wave of his hand, still smiling warmly. I'm truly delighted this time, he said seriously. So, don't hold back. Tell me your heart's desire, whatever it may be. Even if you wish to become a god, marry a goddess, or even pursue my daughter, this time, I can grant it to you. Hearing his words, Promise was really shocked. To be honest, even if the gods outside heard this, they would likely be just as stunned. It was clear from Zeus's offer just how pleased he was with the events that had transpired and how much he recognized Promise's worth. After his initial surprise, Promise quickly calmed down again. He began to think seriously, carefully considering what Zeus had said. After some thought, he raised his head, his clear green eyes meeting Zeus's golden gaze as he smiled softly, and said, thank you, merciful and great king of the gods, and please forgive me for my impertinence. Even in light of your generous offer, I still feel unworthy of asking for a wish after having caused such chaos in your realm. If I must express a wish, then let it be for your forgiveness for all the disrespect I've shown until now. Zeus wasn't angered by this response. Gods can sense falsehood, and he knew that Promise's words were sincere and not just a polite remark. And he also saw that the boy had indeed thought about it for a long time. Therefore, Zeus only asked curiously, "So, is there truly no wish that you hold in your heart?" "Of course, I have desires, great king of the gods," Promise replied with a smile. "I am, after all, just a mere human. Naturally, I have longings in my heart. However, none of them require me to waste your generosity." Because he broken bar since leaving the mountain and meeting the noble Queen Hera, wise Athena, and the others, all my deepest wishes have already been granted by them. When Promise said this, Zeus immediately recalled the vows the promises made between the bot and the gods. "To become a great hero and have a glorious end," he answered, looking at the boy, who nodded to his words, still smiling. Promise really had no need to ask anything more of Zeus. After all, everything he had wanted was something he had already gained from the gods he had met along his journey. If there was anything else he truly needed, a broken bar indeed. The only thing left was that one painting, the portrait of Zeus, king of Olympus. However, Promise wasn't foolish enough to bring that up now, and Zeus certainly wasn't about to offer it. After all, judging by the current situation, what would that painting depict? The king of gods, Zeus imprisoned? Compared to the paintings of the other gods Promise had made, such an image would stand out unfavorably. If he really dared to paint such a picture, it would be surprising if Zeus didn't hurl a few thunderbolts at him in response. "Let Poseidon give you the painting," Zeus said after a moment. This time, he flooded the entire court of Olympus, surely one of the most glorious moments of his life. Promise considered the offer, and this time, he didn't refuse and accepted Zeus's generosity with a calm nod. But, who would have thought that Zeus, who had been smiling the whole time, would say something very sharp this time? "I gave you such a grand wish to fulfill. I thought, at the very least, you'd ask me to pardon Athena and Hera for their rebellious actions." Though he was still smiling at this moment, there was now a sharpness in Zeus's gaze as he scrutinized Promise. The latter remained silent, knowing full well that the best answer would be to defer to Zeus's judgment as the king of the gods. "However, if possible, I truly do hope, great king of the gods, that you can find it in your heart to forgive them," Promise said, voicing his wish. As soon as he uttered those words, the room fell into complete silence. Outside, the stage beyond the floor-to-ceiling window remained lively and chaotic. But within the quiet room, tension filled the air. Suddenly, Zeus lifted his head and looked past Promise, asking, "Why have you come?" Promise, feeling a bit puzzled, was about to turn around when a familiar, tender and soft voice reached his ears. Fate has already revealed that Futuro a broken bar. It was a delicate voice, attempting to sound imposing, though it was still gentle. The soft patter of small, bare feet echoed through the temple as the goddess of fate, dressed in a classical Athenian robe, appeared. A few strands of white hair peeked out from under her hood, and in her hands, she held the crystal orb of destiny. When the sun is swallowed, and a storm of darkness sweeps across the world, and the great kingdom of the gods teeters on the edge, a hero will rise to face the monsters seeking to destroy it. And he will offer them the fruit of Victoria. Broken bar. She spoke softly, and under Promise's surprised gaze, she came to his side and stood beside him. Raising her head, her blind, white eyes, cursed by fate, seemed to meet Zeus's gaze. She appeared to be staring directly at him, yet at the same time, it was as if she was peering far beyond, into the distant future. "And that hero will paint a portrait for himself, a painting he has been waiting for a long time, one that will be the most beautiful of all." When the king of gods Zeus heard this, his expression finally changed, and Promise also looked at her in a daze. Both of them knew exactly what such a painting would represent. And at that moment, the first vow will reach its end, and the hero will fulfill a broken bar, his promise to the goddess. Chapter 176. Daylight has returned. Some time later, Promise walked out of the temple, holding the small hand of the petite goddess of fate, Clotho. Although she had resisted for a moment, in the end, she allowed him to lead her out. Hecate tilted her head to look at the two of them, her expression changing as she quickly covered her face with the veil and ran into the night as fast as she could before hugging the goddess of night, Nyx. Clinging tightly to the ancient primordial goddess, searching for the warmth and comfort only she could provide. She knew that Zeus was about to emerge from the temple, and in the presence of the king of the gods, Hecate needed to feel that tiny shred of security. And the goddess of night, Nyx, also touched her head lovingly. It was mainly because Hecate really tried very hard this time. In fact, it was probably more effort than she'd put in over the past few hundred years. At the same time, Pegasus, who had already recovered, flew back and landed beside Promise. The winged horse cast an accusing, almost resentful look at him. Even Pegasus had been worn out by the power of that arrow, and it wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. But before the horse could voice its complaints with a few annoyed whinnies, Zeus stepped out of the temple, following closely behind them. As Zeus stepped out and looked at those people in front of him, who were still acting. No, it was not really acting. After all, it's revenge when there is revenge, and grievances when there are grievances. Whatever. Looking at the scene, Zeus couldn't help but hum softly. Soon after, thunder rumbled through the night as the king of gods Zeus unleashed his power and began to clear the field. Promise, watching as Zeus strode away, felt more like an observer at that moment. He found a spot on the steps of the temple, sitting down as if he were merely a spectator. He sat down on the steps of the temple nearby and pulled the goddess Clotho to sit with him. So, goddess Clotho, did you really see that future you spoke of? Promise was a little curious. After all, hadn't it always been said that his fate was unpredictable? Moreover, with great self-awareness, if she did see anything, he felt that it would be more like him accomplishing nothing and dying tragically. I did, Clotho answered softly but firmly, holding her crystal ball tightly in her lap, because I know that you will make sure I see that future. Whether he wanted to create miracles or to end his journey in the most gorgeous way, whether he wished to survive against all odds or to face death head-on, Clotho believed it completely, because he was Promise, the one who vowed to show her the most beautiful future. Promise was stunned at first, but after he understood what she meant, he started laughing again. So Broken Bar, we're finally reaching that moment, aren't we? He spoke softly as he looked at the bustling Olympus realm in front of him, which was submerged by the sea, with thunder surging and the gods in chaos. Looking at the scene, he couldn't help but be absent-minded for a moment. Promise. After a long pause, Clotho broke the silence with a soft question. Knowing everything that lies at a Broken Bar, what are you thinking right now? Promise noticed that as she said this her hand had tightened slightly around his. Even though she knew deep down that Promise wouldn't be angry or blame her for revealing his fate, Clotho was still anxious. After all, no one enjoys the thought of knowing their moment of death. Promise came back to his senses, looked back at her, and then chuckled and replied, I was thinking a Broken Bar I might be running out of time. Without realizing it, I've found that I suddenly have a lot of things I still need to do. I need to see through the journey to retrieve the Golden Fleece with everyone. I need to change my teacher's fate. And there are still so many paintings left to complete a Broken Bar. I wonder if I'll have time to finish them all. Knowing his own fate, Promise was filled with both anticipation and a bit of nervousness. As soon as Promise finished speaking, Clotho looked at him with a firm resolution and said, you will accomplish it all. After a Broken Bar, I've been watching over you this entire time. And so, the chaotic battle among the Olympian gods finally came to an end. Zeus suppressed everything with thunder, and what made him speechless was that these guys actually got angry while fighting and making noise. Apollo was chasing Hermes all over the place, Hades and Poseidon both had bruises and swollen eyes, and Queen Hera was tied up again with a look of despair on her face. No matter how hard she struggled, Hera was bound to the chair, completely immobile. Not only did Hestia not help, no, she was helping, but she was helping the goddess of beauty in Hephaestus. She helped to hold Hera down and even blocked her mouth. She just stood there watching Hera, who couldn't even scream, and was laughing so hard that her body was shaking. As the chaos settled, the final moment of this divine drama was marked by Promise, who, floating in the sky, took out his paintbrush. Under the gaze of the gods, he began to paint the scene that had unfolded before them. In the painting, Poseidon, the god of sea, stood tall with his trident, commanding the sea to flood the entire realm of Olympus. The gods were in disarray, caught up in their personal quarrels, while the night sky loomed overhead. Yet, in the sky, both the sun and the moon coexisted, their overlapping light casting a strange and beautiful glow over the chaotic scene. However, the flawless goddess of wisdom, Athena, was absent from the painting. So, when the sea water receded from the realm of gods, the goddess of night Nyx finally left with Hecate contentedly, and the sun rose again. The sun god, Helios, appeared, looking confused as he replaced the night with daylight, bathing the world in sunlight once more. Nearby, Athena, having thoroughly beaten Ares into unconsciousness and vented her frustrations, returned to Promethe's side. She glanced at Clotho, who sat beside Promise, cradling her crystal ball, but said nothing. Instead, Athena quietly sat on the other side of him. "It's time for you to leave," she said softly. "Now that Hecate has gone, the blessings she placed on you will soon fade." "Yes," Promise nodded in agreement. "And please, don't do something like this again." Alas, Athena sighed deeply at his words. Her expression shifted between exasperation, amusement, and a hint of irritation as she responded in a soft voice, "All right, I understand, you reckless fool." Daylight has returned. Standing on the deck of the Argo, the ship that symbolized the glory and adventures of heroes, the beautiful huntress Atalanta gazed at the rising sun, her saintly green eyes reflecting its light as the sea breeze blew through her hair. Before Promise and the gods embarked on their journey to the Olympus realm, Nyx, the goddess of night, had made a declaration: until the king of gods, Zeus, was rescued and the goddess of wisdom was Athena defeated, the sun would not rise. And when the divine realm was in chaos, the goddess of night had covered the entire divine kingdom with her power, thus preventing the destructive divine from spilling into the entire world. However, because of all this, the mortals on Earth had no idea what had happened over the past few days. Many speculated whether the sun god, Helios, had simply dozed off and forgotten his duty. Countless people had prayed to the sun god, urging him to return and shine upon the world once more. In fact, the sun god Helios had been listening to the prayers of these creatures, but there was nothing he could do, so he just lowered his head and pretended not to hear. This was all the reason why, when the chariot of the goddess of night, Nyx, briefly passed by during the transition between day and night, the look cast by the sun god was full of resentment. But of course the goddess of night didn't care about such a small matter. Even after she took Hecate back to the underworld, the corners of her mouth were still upturned. After everything that had transpired, particularly with Hecate's involvement, the ancient goddess's fondness for Promise had increased considerably. "Yes, it has finally returned," the great hero Heracles spoke, joining Atalanta at the bow of the ship, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There, two steep cliffs loomed over the sea, a massive strait, split in two by the force of the ocean. "That must be the Xenos Strait, the one the old seer spoke of, right?" Looking at the mountain that seemed to be cut in the middle, his expression became serious and he said, "It's said that the passage is cursed by a sea god, and when anything tries to pass through, the rocks will crash together, crushing all who enter a broken bar." Though Promise had left temporarily, the adventures of the Argos heroes continued. After departing from the Island of Women, the heroes had quickly found themselves embroiled in another adventure, this time, saving an old seer. The seer's name was Phineus. Once a handsome young man, he had only recently become so frail and aged. A few years prior, he had met one of the Fates and, through their encounter, gained the ability to see the future. However, overuse and pride in his newfound power had led to a curse. Not only did he become blind and age rapidly, he was also targeted by a group of ugly monsters with women's heads and bird-like bodies. Although the monsters would not kill him, they would not allow him to eat. Whenever he wanted to eat something, they would appear and take away his food. When the heroes of the Argo found him, Phineus was nothing more than a skeletal figure, a shadow of his former self, starving and weak. It turned out that those strange birds were actually summoned by Zeus to punish him. He had already foreseen their arrival, knowing that only these heroes could break his curse. Heracles, with his incredible skill in archery, shot down the monstrous harpies that tormented Phaneus. In gratitude, the old seer shared with them the last prophecy he had seen before losing his sight, one that foretold the challenges the heroes would face and the path they must take. Now, before them, was the first of those challenges, the clashing rocks that threatened to crush any who tried to pass. Only by navigating through this perilous strait could the heroes venture further into the open sea and reach the land where the Golden Fleece awaited them. Good thing the sun has risen again. Jason also came over at this time, looking at the strait that was about to arrive in the distance, and said with some fear, "If we had been any later, we would have unknowingly entered the strait and been crushed to pieces when the two cliffs slammed shut." As he spoke, Jason also praised the greatness of Helios, the sun god. Then all the heroes followed suit and praised him, who knew that their voices this time would actually summon the sun god Helios himself. Maybe it was because the heroes gathered together were important enough, or maybe it was because this incident was so inexplicable that he really wanted to share and talk about it with others. "You don't need to praise me," Helios said as he appeared. "To be honest, I have no idea what really happened either." The primordial goddess of night, Nyx, suddenly cast the world into darkness and flew off with the gods to Olympus. There were several major gods among them, including goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, the moon goddess, Artemis, Hermes, and Ares, a broken bar, and the god of war Ares. And when they arrived, the goddess of night Nyx completely shrouded the kingdom of God. For days, something terrible seemed to be happening in the realm of the gods. It wasn't until just recently that things finally settled down. A broken bar. After saying this, without waiting for anyone to ask, Helios ascended back into the sky, feeling much better, leaving behind the heroes who were looking at each other in bewilderment after hearing such shocking news. Atalanta, standing off to the side, raised her eyebrows slightly, deep in thought. She bowed her head, her saintly green eyes flashing with a mixture of hesitation and surprise, as if she had just realized something. "Atalanta, what are you thinking about?" At this moment, Heracles, noticing her expression, suddenly asked. The latter lifted her head and met his furrowed gaze, responding calmly, "What are you thinking after hearing all this?" "You are broken bar. It probably has nothing to do with him, right?" Heracles hesitated, unsure of his own words. "After all, that's the realm of the gods we're talking about." "Hard to say," Atalanta replied, crossing her arms. "Since he descended from the mountain, has anything that's stirred up trouble not been connected to him? Especially with those gods, don't they seem familiar to you? Besides, how could it be such a coincidence? He leaves, and all of a sudden, things start happening." Her voice carried a hint of suspicion, and Heracles couldn't help but waver after hearing it. What? Jason came over at this moment, and asked curiously and puzzledly, "What are you talking about?" Atalanta shot a quick glance at him, then turned and walked away without a word. Jason, left staring at her departing figure, felt dejected as turned to Heracles and said, "Heracles, am I imagining things, or does she really seem to dislike me?" Hercules thought about it for a moment, then replied, "You're not imagining it. She really does dislike you." "Remember who led Promise down from the mountain?" Jason's memory instantly flashed back to when the heroes took turns beating him after he brought Promise down from the mountain, and he became even more sullen. "But it was that guy who wanted to go down the mountain." "Why does everyone blame me for it?" "Because you were the one who actually brought him down," Heracles replied with a chuckle as he said, "Even though we all know it wasn't really your fault, you made it too easy for us to take out our frustration on you." "Ha ha ha!" Heracles laughed heartily as he walked away,